Hey there, welcome back. Tonight, find a comfortable place as we travel toward the cold, starlit horizons of the north. We're entering a world of gods and giants, where the very earth beneath our feet was born from ancient myth. This is the story of the Norsemen, a tale stretching from the silent void of Ginnungagap to the final fading embers of Ragnarok. We'll meet Odin, the seeker of secrets, Thor, the protector of Midgard, and Loki, the chaotic spark that kept the wheels of fate turning. From the branches of the world tree Yggdrasil to the misty halls of hell, we'll discover how a seafaring people imagined the beginning and the end of all things. Now, let's begin. Before we go deeper, please tell me, where are you listening from and what time is it there? I'd love to check the comments. Before the land was shaped, before the sky was stretched wide, or the first tick of time was measured, there was Ginnungagap, the yawning abyss. To the north lay Niflheim, a realm of choking mist and bitter frost. Here, the ancient spring Ymir bubbled, sending out 11 frozen rivers known as the Ylivgar. To the south burned Muspelheim, a land of living flame guarded by the fire giant Surtur. When the warm breath of the south drifted into the void and met the rime frost of the north, the ice began to soften and drip. From those living drops came the first being, vast, heavy and drowsy with ancient strength. His name was Ymir, whom the giants called Orgelmir. Ymir was not a god. He belonged to a race that would one day stand against the gods, the family the poets call the Frost Giants. As he lay down to sleep in the newborn dark, life stirred within him in strange, primal ways. From the sweat of his armpits, a man and a woman grew, fully formed. From the union of his 2 feet, a son was born. This gives us a glimpse into the Norse frankness. In this first family tree there were no weddings or laws, only the impersonal fertility of a world just learning how to be alive. As heat and cold continued their quarrel in the void, a second and gentler creature rose from the melting rime, the primeval cow, Audumbla. Her hide glistened with frost, and 4 rivers of sweet milk streamed from her udder. Upon this milk Ymir fed, a child of ice kept alive by a mother of snow. Audumbla needed food of her own, which she found by licking the salt within the frozen blocks around her. It was slow, deliberate work, like a sculpture performed by a tongue. On the first day of licking, a tuft of hair emerged from the ice, on the second a head. On the third, a whole man stood free, tall, stately and strong. This was Buri, the first of the Aesir line. Buri fathered a son named Bor, who took as his wife the giantess Bestla, daughter of the giant Bolthorn, a name. That means evil thorn. Out of that unlikely union came 3 sons who would rule the stories to come, Odin, Vili, and Ve. Their birth marks the arrival of purpose. Where Ymir embodies bulk and blind growth, and where Audumbla is life in its patient animal form, the 3 brothers bring will, craft, and decision. We should pause over the balance of these origins. Norse myth never pretends that order was easy, or that it belonged to any one side. The first cow was not of divine stock. The first giant was not evil in a modern moral sense. He was simply dangerous in the old practical sense. A force that could drown fields just by rolling over in his sleep. The world was a mixed household from the start. The children of mist and the children of flame shared the same cradle. This is why the old poems speak with such confidence about the inevitability of conflict. Kinship binds friend to foe even before the first spear is lifted. The 3 brothers grew, watched, and learned. They looked out across Ginnungagap, where sparks from Muspelheim settled on the breath of the north, and they understood that power unused is as wasteful as famine. In the ancient sources, the Völuspá and the Prose Edda, these beginnings are described with a plain, haunting force. We are meant to feel the strangeness. Nothing is yet measured by a sun. Days are counted by the rhythm of a tongue against a block of salt. Family starts not with vows, but with sweat and stone. From these few figures, the whole story unfolds. Ymir provides the substance, Audumbla provides the nourishment, and Odin and his brothers provide the mind to order it all. We end this movement at the moment just before the first decisive act, with the giants multiplying in the dark and three young gods looking upon the world as a work that waits for a maker. The three brothers stood before a cosmos that was still unfinished, raw, unmapped, and unguarded, and they chose to intervene. They turned on Ymir, forefather of the giants, not because he was evil, but because he was immense and uncontained, a living mass of matter without limit, direction, or thought. In a void like Ginnungagap, vastness itself was a danger. Their strike broke the ancient stillness. When Ymir fell, his blood erupted in a torrent and rushed outward until it became the oceans. The flood was so enormous it drowned nearly all his kin. Only one escaped, a giant named Bergelmir, who climbed onto a luda, something like a chest or crude boat, with his wife. Together they drifted to the far edge of creation. From them the later giants descended, and so the old enmity survived the deluge, carried forward like a seed that water could not wash away. The brothers then shaped the dead giant into a world. From Ymir's flesh they pressed the earth into being. His bones rose and hardened into mountain ranges. His teeth and shattered jaw became cliffs and fields of scree. Fragments of broken limbs turned to boulders scattered through valleys. They flung his skull high above the new land and made it the dome of the sky. And because even a skull can fall, they set 4 dwarves at the corners of that vault to hold it steady. 4 names that are also directions. Nordri in the north, Sudri in the south, Ostri in the east, and Vestri in the west. Inside that great dome they hung the ornaments of heaven. They gathered sparks from the fires of Muspelheim and kindled them into stars. The drifting tissue of Ymir's brain they released as clouds, an unmistakably Norse image, as if weather itself were only the slow afterthought of a slain giant. Light, however, was not set in the sky for beauty alone. It was set there to measure time. They took Sul, whom the poems describe as a radiant young woman, and placed her in a chariot to drive the sun across the heavens. 2 horses draw it, Arvaka and Alsvita, and a shield rides before them, so the world does not burn beneath the blaze. They set Mani to govern the moon, guiding its phases along his own path. Some tellings say he carries with him 2 children, Bil and Huki, taken on a winter night from a well when they were hauling a pail between them on a pole. A small haunting tale pinned to the vast machinery of the sky, to explain eclipse, fear, and the relentless motion of days. The poets add another force, wolves. Skuld chases the sun, Heti pursues the moon. Their hunger is a clock. For now, their pursuit keeps the chariots running. One day, when the world grows old enough, the wolves will finally bite. Day and night were given faces too, so life would know when to rest and when to labour. Night is a woman of giant blood, dark, seasoned, and wise, who rides a horse named Hrimfaxi. Foam from its bit falls as the dew that lies on fields at dawn. Day is her son, born of the god Dellinger, and he rides Skinfaxi, whose shining mane spills light across the sky each morning. In this way, the Norse imagination gives rhythm to a world that has only just learned to beat. But order on Earth requires more than calendars, it requires shelter. From Ymir's eyebrows, the brothers built a strong enclosure around the new land of humankind. They called it Midgard, the middle enclosure, a ring wall set between the safe, worked fields and the wild edges where anything might return. Beyond that barrier stretched the cold reaches of Jotunheim, where the giants would gather again. Between these realms, a boundary forest rose thick and perilous, a reminder that the line between kin and enemy was drawn by necessity, not by purity or disgust. Later the gods would lay a road in the sky, a shimmering bridge the poets called Bifrost, the rainbow link between their high realm and the middle lands. But for now, the rim of ocean and the wall of eyebrows mark the limits of human life. Even beneath the ground, consequences stirred. From Ymir's decaying flesh came crawling things, maggots in the dark. The brothers, whether moved by pity or by practicality, reshaped them into a small people with minds and speech. These became the dwarfs, living in stone halls and deep caverns, spending long years at crafts that fasten the world together. Old lists speak their names in rapid chains that sound like hammer blows. Some are rulers in the depths, names like Motsonir and Durin echoed in the underground dark. In time, the greatest treasures of the gods will come from dwarf forges. For now, they are the world's hinge points and corner posts, the ones who keep the sky from sagging and the earth from splitting. When heaven was steadied and earth was set, the brothers turned their attention to beings who could walk the shore and look up at the new stars. By the sea they found 2 trunks of wood, one ash, one elm, worn smooth by the water. From these they carved the first man and the first woman, Ask and Embla. Odin leaned close and breathed into them the spirit that lets flesh rise, speak and endure. Vili gave them mind and the quick spark that wakes behind the eyes. V gave them form, voice, hearing, and the power to feel. The poems vary the gifts, breath and wit, warmth and colour, but the meaning is steady. The 2 are made alive, aware, and fair to behold. The gods placed Ask and Embla within Midgard, inside the wall that holds back the sea of Ymir's blood. Within that circle, humans would build halls and make laws, marry and mourn, labour and feast, argue and sing. In time they would fill the earth with many tongues. Still, the brothers did not trust the world to run on its own. They fixed the measures by which life would be kept. They set the course of the sun so summer would not devour the year, and the course of the moon so winter would not stretch forever. They taught people to count nights by the changing face of Mani and to read, seasons by the tilt and temper of light along the horizon. The poets even speak of summer and winter as persons with different fathers. Summer born of a gentle sire whose name suggests pleasant wind, winter of one whose name carries the bite of cold. Because in the Norse mind, weather is not only climate, it is character. The land itself has moods, and those moods demand respect. Yet not everything in the new order was safety and neat measure. The gods knew their world stood between long memory and quick forgetting, so they appointed stewards for the fresh-made places. Wells bubbled beneath roots not yet fully named. Creatures took their stations. An eagle settled in the high air. Something ancient gnawed at the hidden roots of the earth. A squirrel ran messages between heights and depths, messages that were mostly insults, which is the poet's way of admitting that even in a world built by gods, there will be gossip, and gossip leaves marks. And there is one final act of making. The Norse never forget. The gods named what they had made. They named morning and evening, midday and midnight, weeks and years, fields and streams. To name is to bind. It is also to honour. Where other traditions might bless the first loaf with sweetness, the Norse bless the world with words. Once spoken, names settle over the earth like a net of meaning. Under that net, humans can plant. Under that net, poets can remember. Thus the 3 brothers turned raw bulk into a breathing world. They did not create from nothing. They cut and shaped. They measured and restrained. They turned a corpse into a country, a skull into a roof, a breath into a people. What followed would depend on vigilance and craft as much as on force. For giants still lived beyond the wall, and wolves already tested the edges of the sky. But for the first time there was a place where humans could stand, and a calendar by which they could keep their promises. At the heart of everything stands an ash tree so vast its crown brushes the sky, and its roots drink from the oldest waters. The poets call it Yggdrasil. It is not merely a tree, it is an axis, alive, burdened, enduring, the living spine of creation. Its sap is a quiet current holding the worlds in place. When the old songs say there are 9 worlds, they do not mean 9 planets floating neatly in space. They mean 9 realms gathered and hung upon this ash the way bees cling to a branch, distinct, humming with their own life, yet dependent on the same living wood. Yggdrasil is not only a symbol, it is habitat and highway, archive and boundary, a storehouse of lore and a drum that fate itself can strike. When it trembles, destiny trembles. When it thrives, the world steadies. 3 great roots hold the ash firm. Each reaches into a different quarter of existence and sinks into a different well. The first root runs toward the realm where the gods sit in council, there, beside the well, of fate. The Norns keep watch. Their names speak their office. Urd for what has been, Verdandi for what is becoming, and Skuld for what is owed. They are not gentle spinners in a pretty later fairy tale. They are carvers. They cut lines into wood. They score living bark. Each day they draw water and mix it with bright white clay, and with it they paint the trunk so it will not crack. Around their well, sand and green turf remain forever fresh, because they bless it daily with that shining water. From this root seat the gods receive not comfort but judgment, and time itself, for no oath holds and no promise lasts unless the Norns allow it to be written into the grain of the world. The second root reaches outward into the cold, stony places where giants keep their counsel. Beneath that root lies the well of Ymir, a dark mirror that remembers every thought worth keeping. Odin came there once and paid for a single drink with his own eye. The price is the measure of the water. Later, the old god carries Mimir's head, preserved with herbs and spells, and asks it questions, but the head is only the portable fragment of a deeper wisdom. The true reservoir is the root and the well together. When Odin bends over that black surface, he does not see flattery. He sees the hard arithmetic of rule, that holding the centre requires bargains, and that memory, the thing everyone needs, often keeps silent. The third root dives down into a realm of mist where cold streams are born. There seethes the well called Vergelmir, boiling and smoking, and around it creep serpents, slow, patient, tireless. Greatest among them is Nidhogger, who chews at the root with a hatred that never sleeps. Yet he is not a cartoon villain. He is the necessary appetite of endings. He reminds every living thing that wood is still wood, and even sacred ash can be eaten. From that underroot come the waters that feed the first rivers. From those rivers come fog and rain, and the dew that beads on grass. At morning, some songs call those droplets honeydew, food for bees, a precise image, sweetness falling from the crown, while sour work gnaws below. Growth and rot cooperate. The cosmos breathes because both exist. Yggdrasil is not empty wood. It is crowded with life, creatures that are both ordinary animals and living symbols. At the topmost bough an eagle perches and stares beyond sight. Between the eagle's eyes sits a hawk, Vedrfolnir, as though the sky itself needs a sharper sky nested within it. Along the bark scampers Ratatoska, the squirrel messenger, a restless courier whose cargo is mostly insults carried up and down the trunk. He ferries petty malice between heights and depths, and like all gossip, he leaves scratches everywhere he runs. Among the branches, 4 stags browse and worry the leaves: Dane, Dvalin, Dunea, and Durathror. They are the forest's appetite measured in hoof and horn, the small steady consumption that matches the greater gnawing at the roots. And below, beneath them all, Nidhogger is not alone. A tangle of serpents keeps to its dark labour. The tree is fed and bitten at the same time. That is why the poets say Yggdrasil suffers more than humans know. From the halls of the gods there is a daily movement toward that first root. The Aesir ride out to sit in judgment near the Well of Fate. The old verses list their horses by name, bright-hooved animals with ringing syllables, while Thor, the heaviest of them, is said to go on foot through swift rivers rather than cross the Rainbow Bridge, sparing it the weight of thunder. The detail matters. The gods do not drift through eternity. They keep appointments. They sit beneath living boughs and settle disputes. Law, in this telling, is not a cold tablet of stone. It is a living arrangement made under living shade, spoken aloud where the tree can hear, as humans can. Above them, the crown of Yggdrasil catches the light first stolen from Muspelheim and set as sun and stars. Its leaves spread in layers that feel more like architecture than accident, as if the ash were designed to hold the heavens in ordered tiers. Some accounts speak of a stag, Icthurna, standing on the roof of Odin's hall, nibbling at sacred branches, and from his antlers dripping water that runs down to Fergelmere. Scholars argue whether this is Yggdrasil under another name or a neighbouring tree on the same holy hill. The argument matters less than the idea. The economy of heaven closes its loops. What is eaten above becomes a spring below. What is drawn from the root becomes sap, becomes leaf, becomes the food of something else. This is not only allegory, it is how a farm works, it is how a cosmos breathes. Yggdrasil is also road and border. Travellers climb and descend by hidden ladders and unseen paths that twist with the boughs. Odin rides his 8-legged horse along routes that cannot be mapped on ordinary ground. Valkyries carry the fallen along routes that feel like wind but are truly branches. Dwarfs, though they love stone, still measure their halls by how far they lie from the nearest route path. Elves favour the light filtering through the crown and make glades beneath it bright as the inside of a pearl. Giants look at the trunk as a wall that must be tested, and they test it often. In these tales, every crossing of a realm is a crossing of bark. Because of that, the health of the tree is everyone's business. When it thrives, fields bear fruit, ships return, and children are born in the right season. When beetles strip the bark, when serpents chew faster, when the Norns are hindered and cannot tend the trunk, the stories speak of blighted harvests and sick herds. The poets put it simply: the ash groans. It stands and speaks without words, and even the gods cannot pretend not to hear. In the far future, the ash will shake so violently that all creatures will understand the warning. Not yet. For now the Norns still sprinkle their bright water, still mend the surface, still advise the gods who come to judge beneath the boughs. Even the name Yggdrasil carries a story. It means the steed of the terrible one. Ygr is a title of Odin, one that admits he can frighten, as well as inspire, and Drasil means horse. The phrase remembers a brutal initiation. Odin offered himself to himself and hung for 9 nights on the windswept tree to win the runes. In that ordeal, the ash became a mount that carried a god beyond himself and delivered him into knowledge. The name remained to remind listeners that this tree is not gentle furniture. It is a structure strong enough to hold a god in pain. The runes drawn from that moment are not mere letters. They are bargains, strokes that tell wood and water how to behave for a time, small contracts written into the world's grain. A whole doctrine is folded into this living ash. The centre of reality is not a marble throne. It is a plant that must be tended, Fate is not a blind wheel. It is 3 women keeping bark from splitting and time from stalling. Evil is not a painted monster to be booed from the safety of a song. It is an old dragon that keeps chewing whether you sing or not. Hope is not a slogan, it is water. Water drawn from a clear well and poured again on the same rough trunk every morning before judgment begins. In that pattern, humans recognize their own labor. Feed what feeds you. Name what you tend. Accept that part of life will always be repair. So Yggdrasil stands, vast, suffering necessary, binding wells to weather, law to leaf, memory to breath. The 9 realms take their bearings from its roots and boughs. The rainbow bridge touches one limb like a ribbon. The halls of gods, the caves of dwarfs, and the fields of humankind all look toward it when they speak of the centre. Soon the story will step off these branches and walk the realms one by one. But the tree must be understood first, because in this mythology, every journey is, in the end, a journey along its wood. The Norse cosmos is not a clean ladder of heaven above and hell below. It is a living arrangement, layered, entangled, and set upon the body of a great ash. Scholars speak of 9 realms, but the poems never let the map become too tidy. Paths do not always run straight. Borders blur like mist over marshland. What matters most is relation, how each realm leans toward another, how each keeps its own temper and task. Together they form a working universe, one that prizes courage, respects oaths, and never forgets a debt. Asgard stands in the high reaches, where the air is sharp and the ground rings under iron-shod feet. It is the stronghold of the Aesir, a court where law and war and poetry sit at the same table. On the plain of Idavola the gods gather in council. There rises Gladsheimer, the many-benched hall of judgment, and near it Valaskjalf, where Odin's bright roof catches the sun like metal. From the high seat, Hlidskjalf, Odin looks out across the worlds and sees what stirs and what hides, and there too is Valhalla, vast and loud with promise, 540 doors, rafters of spears, shields like a glittering ceiling. Chosen warriors, those lifted from battle, spend their days in contest and their nights at feast, training and eating as if fate itself were a campaign that must be met in good condition. Heimdallr keeps watch near the foot of the Rainbow Road. His senses so keen the poems claim he can hear grass grow and wool thicken on a sheep. Asgard is not a soft paradise. It is a fortress that prepares for the end. Not far in height, though different in spirit, lies Vanaheim, home of the Vanir, gods of sea swell and fertile fields, of diplomacy, wealth, and patient power. The peace after the First War bound Aesir and Vanir together, and that treaty is written into the world structure as surely as any river. Njörður keeps close to shore in Noatun, where the smell of pitch and the sound of oars are constant companions. Freyr, lord of good seasons and fruitful weather, moves easily between Vanaheim and Asgard, like abundance walking in daylight. Freyr brings the art of cedar and rules over Folvanga, where a share of the fallen are welcome beneath her hospitality. Vanaheim speaks softly and grows steadily. Its authority is maintained through gifts, fairness, and the long memory of mutual obligation, not through iron. Alfheim is a bright reach, where light seems to rise from within leaves as much as from any sky. The light elves dwell there, beings the poems describe as fairer than the sun to look upon. Their art belongs to living things, music, bloom, the subtle crafts that do not clang like metal. Old verses say Alfheimr was given to Freyr as a tooth gift when he came of age, a sign that gentle increase and prosperity deserve a seat among the gods. In tales where humans stumble near elves, the world always goes quiet, as if the air itself is kneeling. Alfheimr suggests that beauty is not decoration, it is duty, and that grace is a kind of law. Midgard holds the middle. Its wall, raised from the eyebrows of the primal giant, stands as a ring between the safe fields and the wild beyond. Around it lies the ocean, blood turned to boundary. Humans live here, and their works are brief but earnest. The serpent Jörmungandr encircles the rim, tail in mouth, a living belt that both threatens and protects. In Midgard, people learn measure. They look up to count nights by the moon's changing face, and days by the sun's bright stride. They look outward to judge weather, to know when to sow and when to harvest, and they look inward to keep faith, because law without memory is only noise. The gods walk Midgard often, not only to bless it, but to test it, to see whether humans are still worth the trouble of a wall. Beyond Midgard stretches Jotunheim, a rough land of cold mountains and iron rivers. Giants dwell there, not as cartoon brutes, but as ancient powers with old rights. Some are coarse, some are beautiful and grave, many are wise. Strongholds like Utgarda rise in that country, where giant kings rule with riddles and illusions sharp enough to humble even a thunder god. The boundary between Midgard and Jotunheimer is not only geography, it is temperament. Settled speech on one side, the rough talk of storm and stone on the other. Yet the line is also kinship. The gods marry giants. Rivalries bloom into friendships and back again. Skadi, huntress and giant's daughter, joins the gods and keeps her bow even in bridal cloth. Jotunheimer is the necessary adversary. Without it, courage would have nothing to practice, and cleverness would grow dull. Beneath the skin of the world lies Nidavellir, sometimes called Svartalfaheimer, a realm of branching caverns like roots in endless night. Here the dwarfs keep their forges. They are masters of binding fire into form, and their memory for contracts is longer than a winter night. Old catalogues race through their names like a skald warming his tongue. From their anvils come wonders, rings that drip gold, ships that fold like cloth, oars bristling with light, and a hammer that returns to the hand that throws it. Scholars dispute whether dark elves and dwarfs are the same folk or close neighbours. The poems leave the answer pleasantly unsettled. What is certain is this: nothing in that realm is made in haste. Every good thing must be struck and cooled again, until the world agrees to hold it. Far down and cold lies Niflheim, a brooding region where breath smokes and sound does not travel well. From Vergelmir, the seething well, many rivers rise, names like curses, and creep outward beneath rhymed ice before spilling from the world's edge in a glitter of knives. In that dim country dwell swarms of serpents led by Nidogga, the old eater who gnaws at the roots of the ash and reminds all beings that beginnings decay. Niflheim is not evil by intention. It is endurance, attrition, cold accounting, the part of existence that refuses to be sweet-talked. Opposite it burns Muspelheim, where heat moves like breath, and sparks lift into the air like flocks of starlings. Surtur stands at its frontier with a flaming sword bright to the marrow. The first stars were taken as sparks from this place, and set into the high dome. The lesson of Muspelheim is simple and merciless. Fire is both tool and judge. It lights calendars and consumes what was built without care. It waits. It does not bargain. It does not forget. And then there is Hell, also called Helheimer, reached by a hard road and a bridge that gleams without warmth. One day Hermoda will ride that road with news in his mouth and return with a condition that cannot quite be met. The realm takes its name from its queen, Loki's daughter, half fair and half corpse pale, who receives those who did not die with sword in hand or under the wing of a shield. Her hall is Eljudnir, its dish is hunger, its knife is famine, its threshold a stumble that stills the heart. The river runs dark there, and the bridge over it glows coldly. A maiden keeps the crossing and asks questions that cut clean. A hound waits at the cave mouth, bristling at the scent of souls. In one grim shoreland stand houses roofed with the spines of the faithless, venom dripping from above so that even the ground is unsafe to lie on. Yet most who go to hell are not villains. They are simply the ordinary dead, quiet, dim, remembering the taste of air. The realm is sombre, not spiteful. These 9 realms are not stacked like floors in a tower. They lace through the ash, touch at shifting edges and change with season and mood. Roads and crossings bind them. Bifrost runs between Asgard and Midgard, bright as wet silk, strong enough for daily passage, but not for a full charge by the thunder god, who prefers to ford his rivers on foot. Mountain passes thread from Midgard into Jotunheimr, where wind cuts like a small knife in the lung. Old wells gape in the world, and on certain nights they open again, letting a person step from a forest path into a hall where manners are strange and masks wear antlers. Dwarfs, lovers of contract, demand safe conduct carved with runes before they trade above ground. Elves ask no toll, but demand courtesy that must be exact, as if politeness were an oath. The gods keep routines. Each morning they ride out from Asgard to sit in judgment, holding the centre by decisions that echo across worlds. When they travel farther, they take other names, enter halls as strangers, and test hosts for kindness, or at least for brisk honesty. Over everything move the great, rhythms that sweep all realms together. Day follows night in a wheel that does not miss a spoke. Sun and moon keep their courses with hunters at their heels, who close the distance but never quite catch, until the age grows old enough for teeth. Winds climb from deep cold and descend again salted by the sea. The tide rises and folds back, an ancient habit. Snow builds in the north, rain softens the south. The ash drinks at its roots and breathes through its leaves. The 9 realms do not live beside one another so much as they live through one another. That is why sagas can shift from a farmhouse to a giant hall without apology. The farm and the hall have always been neighbours. Balance in this system is not peace at any price. It is relationship renewed every day by action. The gods hold the centre by keeping oaths and paying dearly for wisdom. The giants hold the edges by testing whatever claims to be final. Humans keep their hearths by remembering what is owed to guest and kin and neighbour. Dwarfs make objects that bind intention into use. Elves remind everyone that light must fall on what is made, or it will not be worth keeping. Cold demands thrift. Fire demands discipline. Death demands honesty. When each receives its due, the worlds hold. When any is cheated, the tree groans. This is the working map. It explains why a fisherman in Midgard thanks a god of Asgard for a fair wind that rose from Vanaheim. It explains why he leaves a coin on a stone, because a dwarf once mended the clasp on his net, and debts are not erased by time. It explains why a poet looks up at night and feels the sky is not empty but inhabited, and why an old woman murmurs a charm at a doorframe as if the wood can hear. In such a world, nothing is only itself. Every realm lends something to the others, every gift has weight, every oath leaves a mark, and every debt sooner or later comes due. This is a compelling narrative of one of the most foundational conflicts in Norse mythology. To rewrite this perfectly, I will elevate the prose to a more skaldic and literary style, focusing on rhythm, evocative imagery, and the philosophical weight behind the clash of these 2 divine families. In the morning of the worlds, when the world ash still wept fresh sap and the rainbow bridge shimmered with a wet newborn dew, a shadow fell across the high fields of the gods. Discord did not arrive with the blare of a horn or the thunder of a cavalry charge. It arrived in the soft, rhythmic footfalls of a woman whose name the poets split like white light through a prism. Some called her Gulvar, the gold drunk, and others called her Haida, the bright one who speaks in flames. She entered the halls of the Aesir with a smile like a buried secret, carrying a craft the gods both craved and reviled. This was Seda, a sorcery of tangled threads and wandering spirits. It was the art of seeing the fruit before it ripened and bending the winds of human luck. Unlike the clean magic of the Aesir, their runes and battle songs, Seda was a boundary art, a household mystery that answered to a will that did not always value the edge of a sword. At first, the High Ones were enthralled. The halls of Asgard glittered with newfound wealth, purses filled with a speed that made even the wisest gods giddy. Words could be made to land like velvet or bite like frost without a single voice being raised. For a brief golden hour, the Aesir believed they were masters of this power. In truth, they were merely its delighted apprentices. Then they saw the price. Seda demanded a vulnerability the strong could not stomach. It required the practitioner to sit apart, entering a trance that left the body unguarded. It asked for value to be found in the shadows and for desire to be named without the protection of armor. The Aesir, a people of iron law and rigid spears, judged the art beneath them, even as they found themselves unable to stop drinking from its well. The ancient songs tell us they tried to end the contagion in the simplest way they knew, with violence. They hurled their spears. They cast the woman into the fire in the center of their own hall. They burned her 3 times to be certain of her end. And 3 times she stepped whole from the ash, smiling as if nothing at all had been taken from her. In these tales, names are not clothes, they are states of being. If she is Gulve, then gold speaks and cannot be hushed. If she is Haida, then the shining speech of the soul refuses to die. The gods learned a bitter truth. Some forces do not vanish just because you find them untidy. They only yield when balanced by a strength equal to their own. The Vanir, the gods' ancient neighbours, keepers of the fruitful field and the shifting wind, claim the woman as their priestess and kin. When word reached them that the Aesir had tried to ash their messenger, their anger was cool and absolute. They sent no heralds to argue terms. They simply made ready for war. The first spear thrown in anger flashed like a sudden change in weather. The first war of the gods had begun. No poet provides a ledger of dates or standard bearers. Instead, we see the signature of the struggle written upon the world itself. The walls of Asgard were shaken and split. Spears lay across the plains like reeds after a spring flood. The Aesir were masters of the open field, charging with charm songs that hardened the heart and sharpened the blade. The Vanir answered with subtleties that softened iron and sowed confusion into the ranks without striking a single visible blow. It was a clash of 2 types of keeping. The Aesir kept order by oath and iron. The Vanir kept increase by gift and craft. Neither could bring the other to heel. As the seasons turned, the war bled into the world of men. In some places the seed failed. In others, it grew with a reckless, choking abundance. Ocean currents shifted. Nets that had never known a dry day came up empty, while in the next moon they rose heavy with nothing but froth. When the mortals asked the Skalds why the world had turned fickle, they were told a truth wiser than comfort. The gods cannot wound one another without the pain running through the stems of wheat and the bones of the cod. When high things fight, the low things pay. Exhausted by the stalemate, the Aesir called for a parley. The Vanir consented. They met on a neutral plain with wide horizons and no cover, for even gods do not care to be ambushed while discussing honour. There, they set down their steel and spoke without shouting. The Aesir admitted they could not erase Seda, nor could they live as if luck and desire were not part of the cosmic order. The Vanir admitted that the field, the womb, and the wind require a house that can withstand a storm, a court of law to settle the envy of men. Each side finally saw that they could not survive without what the other provided. They agreed on peace, but peace among divine houses is more than a handshake. It is a ritual binding. Both parties stepped to a great vat and spat into it. This was an act of profound intimacy. Spittle carries the breath of life and the essence of the body. From this gathered fluid they shaped a new being, Kvasir. He rose from the vat, mild-faced and wise. Kvasir walked among both households, settling disputes with a word. He was never at a loss for an answer, for he understood that no single point of view can hold the weight of an entire world. At this stage, Kvasir is not yet a tragedy. He is a lesson. Peace begins when the words of one side can live comfortably in the mouth of the other. To seal this covenant, the gods exchanged hostages, not as prisoners, but as honoured kin. From Vanaheim came Njord, who rules the coastlines, and his children, Freyr and Freya. The son brought the warmth that wakes the seed. The daughter brought the total mastery of cider, now entrusted to the Aesir as a gift between friends. From Asgard went Hoenir, a chieftain of noble bearing, and Mimir, the wisest of counsellors. For a time, the exchange flourished. In Asgard, the presence of the Vanir brightened the earth. Freya taught the Aesir the very craft they had once feared, building a hall called Sessrumnir that could expand to hold all who sought comfort. In Vanaheim, the Vanir admired the sword songs of the Aesir and the efficiency of their justice. Hoenir presided over their councils with a calm that looked exactly like wisdom. As long as Mimir was at his shoulder, whispering counsel, Hoenir spoke like a man who had slept well and lived 1,000 lives. This would be a beautiful tale if it ended there. It does not. The Vanir soon noticed a pattern. Whenever Mimir was away, Hoenir's wisdom vanished. Faced with a difficult decision, the noble chieftain would stare at the grain of the tabletop and declare that others must decide. The Vanir are not simple, and they are not infinitely patient. They felt they had been swindled, given a fine horse that refused to pull unless the groom was close enough to smell the bit. In their fury, they did something terrible, and something instructive. They cut off Mimir's head and sent it back to Asgard in a sack. The Aesir received it with a grief that burned without smoke. Odin took the head and would not let it sink into silence. He anointed it with herbs, sang over it, and taught it the art of staying. The head did not rot. It spoke into Odin's ear as it had once spoken into Hoenir's. From then on, the Council of Asgard had an advisor who did not need a chair. If that seems gruesome, remember what these myths insist. Wisdom is costly, and the things worth keeping are often kept by a kind of care that looks stern to the soft-hearted. Mimir's death ended the experiment of Hoenir's rule in Vanaheim. The Vanir did not call for more blood. They renounced their anger and accepted the prices paid. The exchange remained balanced, Njord and his children living among the Aesir, and a shared understanding that had not existed before. Kvasir continued to wander and answer every riddle, a living treaty with a voice. In years to come, 2 dwarfs would kill him and brew from his blood a mead that grants poetry and learning, and Odin would steal that mead for gods and men. That theft belongs to another part of our story. For now, keep your attention on what matters here. Peace was made. Its seal walked the roads in sandals, and the 2 houses of the gods became in truth one pantheon. The lessons of the war do not flatter either side. The Aesir misjudged a power because it made them uncomfortable. The Vanir punished deceit with a deed that could not be taken back. The settlement required each to accept what the other did best. And the world prospered because the High Ones admitted what mortals learn more slowly. Strength without growth starves, and growth without strength spoils. The war did not end with a single trumpet or a last heroic charge. It ended with recognition, clean as a north wind. Neither house could do without the other. The Aesir brought iron law, oath, and the proud craft of song that steadies courage. The Vanir brought increase, fair weather, and the deep patience that makes fields and people prosper. So they walked onto a bare plain between their realms, set their weapons aside, and agreed to bind peace in a way that could not be faked. They spat into a great vessel. The act was intimate and solemn, because it carried breath and food, and the truth of a mouth that cannot lie to itself. From that mingled spittle they shaped a man. He stood up calm and bright-eyed and was named Kvasir. He embodied the truce. Wherever he went, he settled quarrels without drawing a blade. He never lacked an answer, not because he was glib, but because he understood the grain of things and spoke with it instead of against it. He belonged to both houses at once and to neither alone, which is the right condition for a keeper of peace. Peace also requires pledge. Each side gave hostages, not prisoners but honoured guests, pledged to live as kin. From Vanaheim came Njord and his children, Freya and Freyja. Njord knows harbours and trade, and the courage that steers a ship through a white-edged channel. He keeps his hall at Noatun, where oar strokes and gull cries mix with the smell of tar and wet rope. Freyja carries the luck of good years and the rain that answers the plough. He is mild and strong, and he smiles like weather at its most generous. Freyja brings the mastery of Saida and the unapologetic knowledge that desire is a force to be trained, not denied. She holds a hall in Folvanga where she receives a share of the noble dead and gives comfort without flattery. In all this, the Vanir did not yield their nature. They brought it intact, as a gift the Aesir needed. To Vanaheim went Honir and Mimir. Honir was tall and comely, and in the first days he spoke decisions that pleased every ear. Mimir was older and less adorned. He carried a mind full of counsel, and an air that warned fools to keep their voices down. For a time the arrangement worked like a well-set weir. In Asgard the sea breathed more kindly, the barns filled, and oaths took firmer hold. In Vanaheim judgments came more quickly, and feasts ended with a final word that did not unravel by morning. Then the weakness in the weave showed. The Vanir discovered that without Mimir at his side, Honir could not settle even a simple dispute. He would say that others should decide. He would admire the ceiling, or the pattern in a board, and pass the matter along. The Vanir are patient, not credulous. They believed they had been insulted, handed a figurehead lent authority by a hidden tutor. Their anger was cold and exact. They took Mimir, cut off his head, and sent it to Asgard without further speeches. Grief in Asgard did not gnash and burn, it worked. Odin took the head in his hands. He anointed it against rot. He spoke charms that keep speech from fading. He set it in a place of honour and asked it questions as a king asks his steadiest friend. Mimir answered as he had always answered, with counsel measured against consequence. The halls of Asgard kept their advisor, and the cost of peace was written in a way no one would forget. Meanwhile, Kvasir walked the roads of gods and men. He visited halls where the fire was low and the benches were plain. He taught a farmer how to divide a field so each son would bless the other. He stood in dwarf forges and asked about the temper of iron, why some metal rings true while another sulks and splits. He taught the difference between a riddle and a trap. He gave riddles that made people better at their work. He did not shame the slow-witted. He waited while they found the thread, and he praised the knot when it held. In the skaldic tradition, a high praise is to say that a man speaks with Kvasir's mouth. In the oldest tales, his end is dark and will matter later. 2 dwarfs will kill him, and brew from his blood a mead that grants poetry and learning. For now he lives, and the treaty walks with him. The covenant also changed custom in Asgard. Saida, once scorned, was taught by Freyja in a manner that kept its power without dishonouring those who learned it. The Aesir discovered that to govern well, they must know not only what men owe to law, but what luck owes to attention. Sharp runes and frank spells held the centre together. Oaths were made on rings that mattered and kept because both houses watched them. Councils at Idavolla grew quieter and more exact. The boast at table gave way more often to a promise that could be counted at harvest. Freya became a welcome guest at every threshold. With him winters bit fairly, and summers did not turn lazy. He walked Midgard as easily as he moved among the gods, and was greeted in ploughed furrows like a neighbour who knows which cloud will break and which will pass. Njord sat with fishermen and shipwrights and showed them how to read the colour of water, where the sandbar moves after a storm. Freya moved through halls and taught women and men alike that craft requires courage and that love has work to do. The Vanir did not come to conquer. They came to complete, and the difference showed in the way bread rose and arguments ended. The Aesir brought their own gifts to the shared table. Tyr set rules for settlement that kept honour without breeding feuds. Frigg taught that foresight is not fear, and that a mother can keep a house from vanity as surely as from hunger. Thor learned to sit in judgment without breaking the bench, and sometimes even without speaking. Even Loki, before his turn toward the worst of his nature, watched and learned how a clever word can mend a torn friendship as well as it can tear one wider. Peace is not a spell that lasts without maintenance. It is a set of habits, watered daily. In the years that followed, the gods remembered that day on the bare plain and kept the memory close when the old suspicion stirred. The sight of Mimir's preserved head in the high hall made princes and poets lower their voices. The gentle authority of Kvasir prevented more fights than any spear, and when envoys came from distant halls, they saw two houses seated together without stiffness. The truce had become kinship. The pantheon truly was one. There is a final scene the poets like to place after the formalities, simple as a good meal at the end of a long day. The gods sit together on Idavolla under the ash, and the talk does not look like debate. Odin's one eye is steady. Freya's necklace catches a small piece of sun. Njord describes a sandbar that shifts with every storm. Frigg asks a question and receives an answer that is both tender and practical. Thor snores discreetly in a corner after too much roast and too many cups, while Tyr watches the door and smiles. Now and then, someone asks a riddle. Kvasir laughs before he speaks. It is the sound that remains after a war that no one won. Thus the covenant of peace did what wars never do. It gave the world more life than it took. It bound iron to reign and law to increase. It made a place where both blade and blossom could be honoured without apology. In that balanced order, our story can move forward to the work of building and keeping. For after peace comes the labour of walls and the testing of wit. After peace came prudence. The gods had learned that strength without vigilance is a promise easily broken. Giants still gathered beyond the boundary forest. The sea still remembered the flood that bled from Ymir. The high field needed a rampart, something that could slow the next calamity and give the watchman time to sound his horn. So the Aesir sat in council on Idavolla and spoke of stone and plan. A stranger arrived while they debated. He was broad-shouldered and close-mouthed, the kind of worker who lets his hands introduce him. He offered to raise a wall around all of Asgard, a fortification so stout no giant could scale it, and to finish the entire work within a single winter. His price struck the hall like a cold wind. He asked for the goddess Freya as his bride, and also for the sun and the moon. There was a long silence. That demand would strip the world of warmth and joy and turn the sky to brass. They would have refused at once if cunning had not spoken from the end of the bench. Loki argued that an impossible bargain is no bargain at all. Let the stranger try, he said, but bind him with terms no mason could meet. The gods agreed. daring and a little careless, and set conditions as sharp as a sword. The builder must complete the wall by the first day of summer. He must work alone. He must take no help from any man. If he failed, even by a single stone, he would receive nothing. If he succeeded, payment would be exactly as asked. The mason accepted. Then he asked leave to use his stallion to haul the great blocks. He named the animal Svadilfari. The gods looked at one another and decided that a horse was not a man. They granted the request, and by that small loophole opened a larger story. Work began at once. Through short days and long nights, the builder cut and set stone. When dusk came, the stallion strained in the harness and dragged boulders that 10 oxen could not have budged. The pace was astonishing. The wall rose clean and plumb, courses fitted with a care that would shame a royal tomb. Each morning the gods walked the line and found whole stretches finished while they slept. Winter thinned. The sun began to remember its strength. Only a few courses remained. The hall grew uneasy. It is one thing to outwit a boastful stranger in theory. It is another to watch him succeed. They called another council and stared at Loki until his silence grew heavy. He had urged the bargain. He must prevent the loss. If the builder collected Freya and the bright orbs of heaven, Asgard would become a place of cold speeches and no harvest. Loki lifted his hands in a theatrical shrug and said he would attend to the matter. It is easier to promise a deed than to endure its consequences. Night fell. The builder yoked Svadilfari and went to the quarry. Snow lay blue under the stars. From the trees came a sound that made the stallion's ears turn. A young mare stepped from the birches and tossed her head, small, quick, beautiful, smelling like spring grass after a storm. She trotted a little way and looked back. Svadilfari forgot the trace chains and the stone waiting on the sled. He whinnied, tore himself free and followed her into the shadows. The builder cursed and ran after them, but he could not match a lover's legs. The horses vanished among the trunks, and the mason found himself alone beneath a pale moon with a useless sledge. All night the stallion did not return. All morning the builder searched and swore. At noon he tried to set stones without his helper, and discovered that his strength, though formidable, was not enough to move what he had planned to move. Evening came empty. The next night the same scene played again. The little mare had a mind of her own, and Svadilfari's mind was entirely hers. The deadline drew near. The final courses remained unfinished. When the gods saw the contract would fail by a narrow margin, they set their jaws and waited. On the last day of winter the stranger raged at the wall, and at the terms, and at the company that had smiled behind their sleeves. In his fury he threw off caution and showed his nature. He was a giant of the frost folk, a master builder with a killer's patience, cloaked in an honest worker's discipline. The moment his true shape stood revealed, the Aesir called for the protector they trust when talk is spent. Thor strode out, lifted the hammer that never misses, and the giant's skull rang once and broke like thin ice. The body fell among the stones he had set so precisely. He died beyond the wall he had nearly finished. The gods did not boast. They had skirted danger and been rescued by a trick. They would not care to describe too fully. The wall stood tall and close-fitted, with only a small loss at the crown. Work the next season would supply with tamer labour. Asgard had its rampart. Freya kept her freedom. The sun and the moon continued their measured courses. But that was not the end. Some months later, a grey foal followed Loki back to the high field. The foal had 8 legs and the calm of a creature that knows no rival can catch it. For it was Loki who had been the mayor in the birch grove. He had taken that shape to lure Svadilfari away, and he had done so quite completely. The offspring of that encounter was Sleipnir, finest of all horses, light of hoof on air, sure of foot on sea. Odin accepted the strange gift without comment, and rode Sleipnir thereafter to places other mounts cannot reach. In time, that horse would carry a messenger to Hel and bring him back again. In time, it would bear its rider over the heads of men and the backs of waves. A scandal had become a treasure. The story keeps a double ledger. On one page, the gods were saved by trickery. On the other, they paid a cost that cannot be counted in coin. Loki had crossed a boundary and returned with a gift that both enriched and unsettled the company. The wool was won, but by means that left a taste. The lesson does not flatter Asgard. Contracts must be drafted with care. Counsel taken in haste will demand repayment. Strength is necessary when guile has gone too far. Yet the tale does not argue for a world made only of careful minutes and clean edges. It argues for watchfulness, for honest work by day, and for the understanding that night will sometimes require an art that does not sit comfortably at the open table. When the watchman later looked out from Himinbjorg, he saw the new wall catch the morning and throw it back across the roofs. When the wolfish wind came down from the glaciers, it met stone that did not flinch. When messengers arrived at the gate, they passed through a doorway made by a giant's hand and a god's demand. This is how the High Ones keep their home. They accept that orders built out of unlikely partnerships. Even a foe can be harnessed to the work of safety, though it is best to keep a thunderer within call. The new wall had barely settled on its foundations when mischief slipped inside the gates. Loki, restless as a spark in dry straw, crept behind Sif as she slept and sheared away her famous hair. By morning, the hall saw Sif shorn and shamed. Thor rose from the bench like weather turning. He seized Loki and swore to silence the trickster forever unless Sif's golden hair was returned, whole and untouched, as if no blade had ever come near it. Loki begged for time, and when Thor loosened his grip, he fled down into the dwarf halls where the anvils never cool. He went first to the sons of Ivaldi, master smiths who worked in caverns that smelled of coal and clean metal. Loki bargained, flattered, and swore their names would be sung in Asgard if they would create a marvel worthy of the gods. They drew out gold as a baker draws dough and spun it into strands finer than wheat at harvest. What they placed in Loki's hands looked like a soft fall of sunlight. Set upon Sif's head, it would take root and grow, and it would never dim. And the sons of Ivaldi did not stop there. In the same workshop they shaped two more wonders. For Odin, they forged a spear called Gungnir, straight and terrible, a weapon that would strike true and never miss its mark. For Freyr they built a ship named Skidbladnir, broad of deck and steady on any sea, yet so cleverly made it could be folded like cloth and carried in a pouch. Loki, seeing a chance to turn fear into praise, decided 3 gifts were not enough. He crossed to another forge where 2 brothers worked with fewer words and a steadier rhythm, Sindri and Brokkr, though some call the maker Atri. Loki spoke like a merchant who senses the day slipping away. He boasted that the sons of Ivaldi had made treasures beyond compare, and he laid a wager, his own head, if these brothers could not do better. Pride and Craft looked at each other and nodded. The brothers agreed. Sindri laid a lump of pig iron on the anvil and told Brokkr to keep the bellows pumping without falter, no matter what happened. Loki turned himself into a biting fly and set about ruining the work with a persistence that would have impressed a saint, if saints had reason to admire flies. As the iron glowed, Loki sank his sting into Brokkr's hand. The dwarf clenched his jaw and kept the bellows breathing, steady as the wind itself. Sindri lifted the lid of the forge and drew out a boar. Its bristles were gold, and they shed light enough to thread through night forests as if it were noon. This was Gullinbursti, the golden-bristled one, a mount for Freyr, swifter than any horse, tireless in deep snow, and sure even over the sea before the wind. Sindri set the boar aside and laid a block of gold in the coals. Again he warned Brokkr, "No matter what, do not stop." Loki flew to the back of the dwarf's neck and stung until blood ran. Still the bellows didn't rest. From the mould came a ring, heavy and flawless, named Draupnir. Every 9th night, 8 new rings of equal weight would drop from it, measured abundance, a kind of wealth that returns on its appointed day. For the last trial, Sindri placed iron in the forge and told Brokkr that now failure would be costly. Loki fastened onto Brokkr's eyelid and bit until blood flooded his eye and blinded him. Brokkr brushed at his face, and for a brief moment the bellows slowed. Sindri drew the work out at once, and there lay a hammer. The head was perfect, the temper true, the metal such that it would never crack. But the handle had come out a little short. Even so, the tool had a name that silence accepts. This was Mjolnir, the crusher, lightning given weight, the weapon the world needed, whether the world knew it or not. When the forging was done, the dwarf brothers carried their gifts to Asgard and demanded a fair hearing. The gods gathered in the high hall, light falling slant through beams and smoke. Loki presented the hair that would grow upon Sif's head again. He displayed the spear that would not fail, and the ship that could carry an army and still fold into a parcel. Then Brokkr stepped forward with the boar that shone in darkness, the ring that renewed itself, and the hammer that returned to its owner when thrown. The assembly judged with the care of those who have seen fraud and learned its smell. At last they ruled that Sindri and Brokkr had won. Mjolnir weighed most heavily on the scales, because it would stand between Asgard and ruin when the giants came over the ice. Brokkr then asked for payment according to the wager. Loki's head had been pledged. Loki smiled with the air of a scribe who has found a hidden clause. He agreed that his head could be forfeit, but his neck, he said, had not been part of the bargain. To take one without harming the other was impossible. The gods were not a court for tricks, yet they enjoyed a clean point when it served justice. Brokkr accepted that he could not claim the neck, but he said nothing about the mouth. He took a thong and a bodkin and sewed Loki's lips shut. For a time, the hall rested from quick remarks that cut deeper than they seemed. When the stitches were finally loosed, the scar remained, a reminder that speech is both tool and hazard, and that words carry a price. The gifts were distributed with ceremony. Sif's golden hair was placed upon her head and took hold like ivy. It grew at once and shone, and with it, her honour stood whole again. Odin received Gungnir and marked treaties with its point so that oaths would hold. He took Draupnir as well and set it upon the altar, for the ring measured time and brought steady bounty. Freyr claimed Skidbladnir for the season when the gods would sail north, and for any journey where harbours were narrow and winds uncertain. He took Gullinbursti too, a proud companion for dark rides, and when the mountain paths were thin as a knife, Thor lifted Mjolnir and felt his hand become complete. The hammer would break the skull of any giant. It would return when thrown. It could bless a cradle and a marriage bed with the same sure strength it carried into war. Thor laid it across his knees, and the hall breathed easier. Old verses love to count the uses of these wonders. When Thor hurls the hammer, mountains remember the blow. When Odin casts Gungnir before battle, he claims the field and fate tightens around it. When Freya rides the golden boar, the dark gives way and roads become possible. When Skidbladnir is spread, it holds a troop of gods. When folded, it slips beneath a cloak. When the 9th night comes, Draupnir drops its golden brood, and the temple chest fills in a way that is both literal and sacred. And when Sif walks, light plays across her hair, and people remember that beauty restored is not vanity. It is a sign a house has stood back up after the storm. It would be tempting to say Loki learned a lesson. He learned a technique. He would return to the forges again in other tales, and not always for good. Yet even here, where spite began the business, the end was a strengthening of the realm. Asgard now held tools worthy of its charge. The gods saw that craft can equal courage, that law without gifts is cold, and that gifts without law invite theft. The dwarfs returned to their caves with the satisfaction of makers who have answered a boast with proof. The trickster nursed his mouth and considered vengeance in a way that would later cost the world. In the evenings that followed, when council was finished and the meat was carved, Thor would sometimes set Mjolnir on the table and draw a finger along its edge, as if greeting an old friend. Odin would weigh Draupnir in his palm and feel time like a heartbeat. Freya would call for Skidbladnir to be opened in the yard, just to watch the ribs spread and the sail catch a friendly breath. And Sif would unbraid her hair, and it would fall like a river over her shoulders. In those moments, the gods looked less like distant legends, and more like people who understood what it meant to keep a home in a dangerous world. Among the many names of the High God, one rises whenever the subject is knowledge bought at a cost. He's called the All-Father not only because he leads the company of gods, but because he feeds his mind on every source of counsel he can reach. Valor is common coin in Asgard. Clear sight is rarer. Odin wanted that sight so completely that he sought the oldest spring beneath the world tree, the well kept by Ymir, whose counsel endures like iron set in cold water. The road to that place is not easy. It runs outward toward the lands of giants, where stone holds its breath and the wind is lean. There Ymir sits as if grown from the same rock, a guardian who does not flatter the thirsty. The water he keeps is not a fountain for travellers, but a store of memory gathered since the first days. It does not give answers to those who want shortcuts. It gives a pattern only to those who will carry the weight of it. Odin came to the well and asked for a drink. He did not plead. He stated his need the way a king states a claim. Mimir answered the way keepers answer when they understand the price of what they guard. He named a pledge that would mark the bargain forever. The god must leave one eye in the depths. Odin accepted at once. He plucked out his own eye and placed it in the spring. The water took it. In that moment he gained a kind of vision that does not belong to a face. From then on his single gaze looked outward, while the eye below looked into the past and the dark. He paid, and he drank. What he took in with that draught was not a mere list of facts. He tasted the way fate grows, slow and stubborn, like lichen on stone. He saw that counsel matters most when taken before a spear is raised, and that even wise kings pay for understanding with something that will not grow back. This first sacrifice made him sharper, not softer. He learned that the hidden grammar of the world is written in signs older than speech, and he set himself to win them. So he turned away from feasting and comfort and undertook an ordeal that no other god even considered. At the heart of the ash, he chose a bough that leans over darkness. There he wounded himself with his own spear and gave himself to himself. He hung for 9 nights and 9 days. He ate nothing and drank nothing. He stared downward where the wind scrapes bark and the root breathes cold from the deep. Old verses preserve his voice without ornament. He says he hung on the tree whose root no one knows. He says he was pierced and given to the god that he is, meaning he paid himself into his own keeping. He says he peered until he saw the shapes of power turn and flash beneath him like fish just below the surface. These were the runes. They are not decorations, and they are not merely an alphabet. Each one is a small treaty between will and world, a stroke that can persuade wood and water and iron to listen for a time. When he recognized them, he reached and seized them. He fell from the branch and stood on the ground again, changed in a way that made even his friends wary. Afterward he taught the names and uses of the signs to those who could carry them without folly. The hardest work he kept for himself. He learned charms for binding and loosening, for closing a wound and cooling a fevered head. He learned how to blunt a blade without touching the metal. He learned how to tie a knot into a gust so a sailor can buy a breath of wind when the sea forgets to move. He learned how to take the heat out of a blaze on a friend's shield and how to free a hostage without breaking a single link in the chain. The poems count more than a dozen such workings and hint at others not put into words, because the wise do not boast too much about what they can do. To make this new sight serve more than a single moment, Odin ordered his life around counsel. At dawn he sent his ravens out. One is called Thought, and the other Memory. They fly across the world and return at evening to settle on his shoulders and speak softly into his ear. Their reports are not gossip. They bring the grain of each day, what men dared, what kings promised, what strangers attempted on dark roads and bright seas. In the high hall 2 grey wolves lie at his feet, and he breaks bread with them more often than he eats himself. He sits while the company feasts and listens, letting his mind travel the lines that his eye in the well and his remaining eye and his head together lay before him. Because he had drunk at Mimir's spring, he kept seeking counsel in many forms. He spoke with women who see what is coming when others see only steam on a kettle. He paid for truth from those who live at the edges and do not need the praise of courts. He kept Mimir's head preserved with herbs and spells and consulted it still, not as a puppet, but as an elder. He did this without shame. In these tales, a ruler is not made smaller by taking advice. He is made larger by knowing which advice is dear and which is cheap. These gains did not make Odin gentle. They made him serious. When he sets a spear over a battlefield, he does it as one who knows what the aftermath will cost in mothers, in fodder, and in time, and who still believes some strife cannot be delayed without worse harm. When he bargains with giants, he does not reach for a hammer first, not because he fears them, but because the price of a broken truce is always paid by someone who never sat in council. When he chooses men for his hall, he chooses not only the bold, but those who kept their oaths when it was inconvenient. And the poets are clear, that second quality pleases him as much as the first. His worship among men reflects the same character. Those who tied a noose to a branch to dedicate an offering to him knew him as the god who understands the edge between life and learning. Those who cut runes into the haft of an axe or the lintel of a barn door did so believing that order is not merely declared, it is carved. Those who asked for a whispered hint before risking a voyage or a judgment brought him a portion of what they had and asked him to pay attention, which he did when the request was worthy. There is sternness in this portrait, but not gloom. The law is simple, wisdom can be had, and it is worth its price. The sight he won at the well made him the kind of king who does not blink when a friend must be told a hard truth. The strength he won on the branch made him a maker of songs that do not flatter, and of spells that hold when storms test the rafters. If other gods love contest, or comfort, or the shine of gold, Odin loves the moment just before a choice, when the air is clear and a man can see what line he must take. In the seasons that followed these sacrifices, the worlds shifted their posture by a small degree. Judgments given under the ash grew sharper. Oaths taken on the ring were spoken with more care, as if the oath-takers felt the ring itself was listening. The watchman's horn sounded no more often than before, but when it did, the company moved with the efficiency of those who have rehearsed, and do not boast about rehearsal. It is not magic alone that holds the centre. It is attention to the way things are joined. From the first sip at Mimir's spring to the nights when he let wind and darkness teach him the runes, Odin shaped himself into a ruler who understands that power without knowledge is a gloved hand that cannot feel the work. He didn't gather these things to decorate his legend. He gathered them because a world fenced with a giant's eyebrows and defended by a hammer still needs a mind that sees before others see, and pays before others pay. Peace gave the gods time to listen. From that listening came the living pledge of truce, a being who walked the worlds with answers that fit like a key in a well-made lock. He did not argue, he clarified. He travelled to smoky halls under black rafters and to caverns where iron sweated against stone. No riddle overcame him, but wisdom draws both love and envy. Two dwarves, Fjalar and Gala, invited him to their bench and murdered him. They drained his blood into a kettle and 2 vats, mixed it with honey, and brewed a mead so potent that a single draught granted poetry, scholarship, and quick understanding. They named the vessels Odrerir, Bodn, and Son. From that hour, poets could say that verse is Kvasir's blood, and learned speech could be called the draught of Odrerir. Fjalar and Gala did not keep their crime quiet. They boasted, and then they compounded it. They lured a giant named Gilling onto the sea and drowned him. When his wife wailed, they dropped a millstone on her at the threshold and ended her grief. Their son, Suttung, came raging for justice. He seized the dwarves and set them on a skerry, then waited for the tide to pull them away like chips of bark. The dwarves bought their lives by giving him the mead. Suttung carried it inland to a mountain and hid it in a chamber cut from rock. He set his daughter, Gunnlod, to guard it in solitude, with a stout heart and a steady cup. Odin heard of these events as a king hears of a threat to his people. He knew the mead was more than a sweet drink. It held the ordered fire that teaches the tongue to name truly. He resolved to win it for the gods, and for those mortals who could shape words well. He set out in a plain hat and a blue cloak and took a working name. Men called him Bolverker, doer of difficult deeds. On a summer day he came to a hayfield where 9 men swung their scythes, pulling green waves from the meadow. Bolverker praised their cutting and drew a whetstone from his belt. With a few short strokes he made the blades sing. Each man begged to buy the stone. He tossed it high. They fought for it and killed one another in the grass. Odin walked onto the farm of Baugi, Suttung's brother. Baugi met him with an empty face. His 9 servants lay dead in the field, and the season was moving. Bolverker offered to do the labour of all 9 if Baugi would ask Suttung for a single drink of the mead as payment. The bargain was struck. Bolverker cut hay and stacked sheaves and did not tire. When the work was finished, Baugi went to his brother and asked for the agreed sip. Suttung refused. He would not part with a drop. Wisdom had cost him blood, and he trusted no one with it. Bolverker did not withdraw. He produced an auger called Rati, and the 2 of them went to the mountain. Bolverker set the point to the rock and told Baugi to bore. When Baugi said the hole was through, Bolverker blew into it, and the dust blew back into his face. He told Baugi to bore again. The second time the dust flew inward. The rock was open. Bolverker changed himself into a snake and slid through the narrow cut. Baugi struck at him with the auger, but the serpent had already passed beyond the reach of a jealous brother's arm. In the chamber beyond sat Gunnlod on a stone bench before the 3 vessels. She'd kept a long watch. She'd been taught to distrust. Odin did not creep past her like a thief. He became a young man who spoke with quiet gravity. He asked for a place to sit, and for a word. She gave both. He asked for a bed for a single night. She asked for a promise that honoured her solitude. He stayed 3 nights. He spoke to her of dawn on snow, and of the kindness a steady hand shows to a full cup. And he listened when she spoke of a mountain that does not sleep, and of duty that does not ask for praise. When the 3rd night ended, she opened the stoppers and granted him 3 drinks, 1 from each vessel. Odin put his mouth to Odrerir and drew not a sip but a vat. He drank Bodn empty. He emptied Son. He had promised 3 drinks, and he had taken 3, yet all the mead was gone into him. He changed shape again and became a great eagle, his shadow crossing the stones like a storm cloud. He beat the chamber with wind and burst into the light. Suttung heard the thunder of those wings and took eagle form to give chase. They tore across the sky above fjord and field. Men below lifted their hands to shade their eyes and wondered why day had darkened at noon. In Asgard, the gods saw their king coming with his belly full of a treasure that must not be spilled into the sea. They set vats near the wall and called to him like men calling to a ship running before a gale. At the last moment, Odin crossed the rampart, flared his wings and spat the mead into the waiting tubs. Suttung, baffled and beaten, dropped from the sky and turned back to his own high crag. Not all of the mead made it over the wall. A few drops fell along the way. Those scattered drippings are said to belong to rhymers who mistake speed for art, and to scholars who carry many facts and little sense. The good portion stayed with the gods to be given as they pleased. From that day, scholars say that poetry is the drink of dwarves, the ransom of Suttung, and the cargo of the eagle. They call it the wave that breaks on the lip of the wise, and the ale that flows from a hidden drawer. They thread kennings like beads on a string to honour the story of its theft, and to prove they are of the company that remembers. Odin did not hoard the prize behind a locked door. He poured from it sparingly, and in season. He gave a mouthful to a youth who could listen longer than his peers. He blessed a woman who recited laws so clearly that quarrels ended at her word. He tipped the vat toward a farm boy whose verses kept men at the oar through sleet. He let a few drops splash on a craftsman, who then cut runes on a beam with such grace that a hall felt sound when the storm struck. And when a scold asked and was turned away, it was not stinginess. It was craft. To waste a vintage is a sin against the vine. The story has edges that teach. The dwarves show that craft without conscience will trade lives for. Applause. The giant shows that grief can harden into avarice and turn to stone in the chest. Gunnlod shows that duty can soften without dissolving, and that keeping watch does not forbid love. Baugi shows that a man can be used when he will not learn to say no. Odin shows that cunning, when it serves order, becomes a kind of harvest. He steals, but he steals a stolen thing, and he releases it from a locked mountain into the living world. Because of that theft, the North learned to treat words as work. The mead did not turn fools into sages. It lifted the effort of the willing. It sharpened what was already trying to become sharp. It made verse that could carry a ship through black water without the crew losing heart. It made law that could hold a family together through a bad winter, when hunger makes people petty and fear makes them cruel. It made historians whose lists do not taste of dust, because they know what matters and what is just noise. It made riddlers who do not waste your evening, because cleverness, when it is honest, aims to clarify. In halls where a skald stands to pour out a praise poem, you can still feel the story behind the sound, the echo of an eagle's wings over a high wall and the quiet presence of a woman in a stone chamber who opened her hand to a guest and believed that a gift given in good faith can bless more than one house. When night falls in Asgard and the benches go quiet, a cup sometimes passes, darker than wine, clearer than water. Odin lifts it and studies its surface the way a farmer studies a bucket at the well, judging the day by the reflection. He drinks, and the hall warms by a degree no hearth can supply. Then, the next morning, somewhere in Midgard, a new verse comes to a young mouth. A sailor, speaking low, finds the right words to honour a dead friend without turning grief into noise. A child repeats a proverb that rings like iron and saves an older man from a bad decision. The mead travels again by ways no road shows. Thus the mead of poetry came into the keeping of the gods. It keeps company with the runes, and with the eye that sleeps in deep water. Together they form a triad of Odin's will. He paid, he suffered, he stole. In each act the end was the same, he made us. A world of lore and risk and song a little more able to bear its weight, and yet the gods do not pour this gift without measure. A cup shared too freely becomes cheap, and cheap words rot. So the mead is given in season to those who can carry it without spilling it into vanity. The mead is not the only lesson the gods leave behind. One story teaches what words can build. Another teaches what power cannot always force. And if Odin's tale is about taking a treasure and turning it into a tool, Thor's is about learning that strength without clear sight can be made to stumble. The protector of Midgard does not sit long at a bench. Thor is at home in the noise of wheels and the smell of storm. When he travels, he rides a chariot drawn by two goats, Tangjoster and Tangrisnir, names that crackle like dry wood in a hearth. When night overtakes him in the wild, he slaughters the goats for supper and lays their cleaned bones on the skins. At dawn he raises the hammer over the remains, and the goats stand whole again, shaking their ears as if they had only slept. The rule is strict. Do not break the marrow bones. A poor farmer learned this too late. Loki urged the farmer's son to crack a leg for the sweet core. In the morning, one goat rose with a limp. Thor saw the splinter and his face hardened. He forgave the family but took the children as recompense, Thialfi, sharp-eyed and quick, and his steady sister Röskva. From that day they ran beside the Thunderer. With Loki as companion and Thialfi close at heel, Thor set out eastward for the land of giants. He didn't like to use the Rainbow Road. He waded rivers instead, a habit both practical and proud. Beyond the high wall the world felt wider. The trees stood far apart in giant forests, and the sky seemed taller. One night they found a great hall with a low door and no smoke hole. They slept there, grateful for shelter, though the place smelled strange, and the floor sloped as if it had been built in haste. Near dawn the building heaved. The ground trembled. The walls groaned like old ships. Thor rose and stood in the doorway with his hammer. Outside lay a shape that filled the valley, a man so large that a glove drop from his belt would look like a house to smaller folk. The hall where they had slept was the thumb of that glove. The smell that had troubled them was the sweat of a giant who had thrown it aside. His name was Skrymir. The meeting was not friendly and not quite hostile. Skrymir spoke like a man who has no need to shout. He tied his food into a bag and offered to share the road. They walked all day beneath trees that rose as if titans had sown them into the earth. When evening fell, Skrymir tossed the food bag to Thor and told him to eat. The knot was bound with a trick of sinew that refused every tug. Thor pulled until his hands burned. He bit the thong. He worked it with every art he knew. The bag did not yield. Hunger makes even the patient short-tempered. Thor stepped back, gripped the hammer, and struck Skrymir's head with a blow that should have split a boulder. The giant opened one eye and asked if a leaf had fallen. He rolled over and slept. Near midnight Thor struck again, harder. Skrymir stirred and wondered aloud whether a bird had dropped a twig. He snored. Toward dawn, Thor gathered every part of his strength and swung so the hammer blurred in the air. Skrymir woke, rubbed his forehead, and asked if a nut had fallen from a branch. Then he rose, pointed them toward a stone fortress called Utgard, and went on his way. Thor later found 3 deep dents in a nearby hill where the blows had landed. He understood that some trick had turned his strength aside, and that anger spent too early is wasted. He kept it, folded it small, and moved on. Utgard rose from the flat land like a cliff doing a soldier's duty. Its wall was so tall Thor could not see the top, even with his shoulder against the stone. The gate was shut and showed no latch. They searched and found no seam, until at last they slipped through the bars as easily as a hare through a comb. Inside sat a company of giants. At their head was a king with a face like a winter sky. He named himself Utgarda Loki. He welcomed them with courtesy that had iron in it, and said no one would stay unless he won honour in a contest. It is hard to refuse a challenge when a hammer hangs at your belt. Loki offered first. He claimed he could eat faster than any man in the hall. A trough was set on the floor, heaped end to end with roasted meat. A rival took the far side, a lean fellow with calm eyes named Loki. At the signal they began, Loki ate like a man raised between feast and famine. He reached the middle and lifted empty hands. Loki reached the middle too and kept going. He consumed meat, bones, and even the wooden trencher beneath. The king nodded. Loki had eaten well, he said, but not as well as fire eats. Loki was what his name suggested, wildfire in a man's shape. Thialfi spoke next. He claimed he could outrun anyone. The king called his runner a lank youth named Hugi. They ran outside on level ground. The first race ended almost before it began. Hugi finished while Thialfi was still far behind. The second was closer only by kindness. The third humbled him completely. The king praised the boy's courage and spoke the truth. Hugi is thought. No foot outpaces it. Now the hall looked to Thor. Utgarda Loki pointed to a drinking horn and smiled. Any strong man, he said, should drain it in one pull, or at least in two, and certainly in three. Thor lifted the horn and drank, long. When he set it down, the level had dropped scarcely a finger's breadth. A murmur ran through the benches. Thor drank again. The fall was little more than the first. A third time he drank until his chest burned. Still the horn looked nearly full. Thor wiped his mouth and kept his silence. The king remarked that he had seen many do better and few do worse. The insult walked the edge of courtesy. Thor kept his hand from the hammer by a thin mastery. The king offered a second test. A grey cat lay near the benches, long-backed and watchful. If Thor wished to prove strength, let him lift it. Thor stooped and set his hands beneath the belly. The cat arched, until its back rose like the roof of a hall, and its paws seemed to brace against the corners of the world. Thor strained until his knees shook and managed to lift only one paw from the floorboards. The hall laughed. The last test was wrestling. The king said he had no man quite Thor's size, but an old woman in his house would match him for a fall. Her name was Ellie. She entered veiled, moving with the careful steps of someone who counts each breath. Thor gripped her lightly, because he was not without decency. Ellie answered with a grip that tightened like rope swollen by rain. Thor pressed forward. She bent like a reed and did not topple. He shifted for her ankle. She set her foot, and his balance left him as if the floor had turned to mud. He planted himself and drew on every muscle in his back. Ellie forced him down to one knee. The hall clapped in rhythm. The king raised his hand and ended the match. They were fed well, which is to say that insult here did not lead to murder. Thor sat with eyes that measured distances. At dawn, Utgarda Loki walked with them beyond the walls and told the truth. Ymir had been himself, he said, and the knot on the food bag was bound with spell work. The 3 missed hammer blows had carved valleys in a hill, each one strong enough to kill a giant if it had landed clean on a skull. The contest in the hall were wrapped in illusion because he would not risk the ruin of his court by letting Thor's power run loose. Loki had eaten against wildfire. Thialfi had raced against thought. The horn was joined to the sea. Thor had drunk so deeply that men later noticed the shoreline pull back and gave that mystery a plain name, Tide. The cat was the Midgard serpent in another shape, and when Thor lifted one paw, he forced the world coils to shift. Ellie was old age. No one at any time has thrown her. Thor gripped the hammer, white-faced with anger, and stepped forward to end the tricks with a single clean blow. Utgarda Loki raised a hand. The fortress vanished like frost under sun. The plain lay empty. The air was very clear. Loki and Thialfi stood quiet. understanding that some victories are refusals and some defeats are lessons. Thor saw why he'd been measured by illusion, because otherwise the ground itself might have broken. He tightened the strap of the hammer and turned west. He had not won a single boast, yet the giants had learned what kind of neighbour lived beyond the boundary forest, and in the years after, when skalds told the tale by winter light, men nodded and said that power and guile are both needed to keep the Midlands. Thor woke and reached for the comfort that always lay within his hand. The bedplace was empty of weight. He groped for the square head and the short haft that fit his palm, as if the two had been carved from the same piece of fate. There was nothing. He sat upright, and the hall rang with a silence that only danger can make. A world without the hammer is a house with the door taken from its hinges. He found Loki and said only that the hammer was gone. Loki understood that this was not a matter for a council at leisure. He went to Freya and asked for the falcon cloak that lets a god move like a gust from cliff to cliff. Freya did not ask why. She opened the chest and set the feathered garment in Loki's hands. He shook it out, pulled it close, and the man became a bird with a clever eye. The air took him up and he flew eastward until the ground below grew broken and bleak, and he saw a burial mound with a figure seated upon it. The giant was Thrym. He braided gold for his dogs and stroked the manes of his horses as if wealth were a kind of grooming. Loki perched and spoke in the neat riddles that pass for courtesy in a hard land. Thrym did not waste words. He said that he had taken Mjolnir and buried it 8 leagues underground, where no hand of God would find it. He would return it when Freya came to his hall as a bride. He smiled and named the price as if he had ordered a cart of timber for a new roof. Loki's wings beat once. He turned in the air and went for Asgard like a spark for dry tinder. When Thor heard, he did not answer with a line of poetry. He went to Freya and told her what the giant demanded. She didn't pretend to consider. Brisingamen trembled on her breast, and the anger that lifts a sea filled the room. She refused with a force that sent the floorboards to talking. The gods met then in council, and sat heavy on their benches. Disaster sat with them. There is wit in Asgard, but not enough wit to meet a world without the hammer. Heimdall spoke, whose sight looks along futures with a steadiness men rarely match. He said that there was a way. Dress Thor as the bride, place the keys of a married woman at his belt, lay Brisingamen on his chest, pull a high veil across his face, and set him beside a maid who can talk fast. Loki said that he would be the maid. Thor grimaced and said that the halls would never finish talking if he wore a bridal veil. Loki answered that the halls would have no one to talk in them at all if Mjolnir did not come home. The company agreed. There was no second plan. They dressed him with care. The goddess Freya lent the necklace. The women of Asgard brought brooches and rings enough to soften even a frame that had thrown down mountains. They hung a ring of keys at the girdle, the sign of a matron whose house is large. They drew the veil close and shaded the eyes that blazed like forge fire. Loki put on a maid's dress and tucked a knife in the folds, because even handmaids should have resources in strange houses. They led the pair to the yard where the goat chariot waited. The wheels rattled and the sky hardened as they crossed from the known to the borderlands. Thrym's hall was high and raw-edged. He came out to meet his treasure with a grin that had counted all its teeth. He called for benches and meat and a feast to crown the bargain that would give him both a goddess and the hammer that blesses a house and a birth and a burial. The giants carried in an ox roasted whole and fish on great platters, and vats of mead that smelled of clover and iron. The bride sat with her veil in place and began to eat. She cleared an ox to the bone. She swallowed 8 salmon, shiny with fat. She finished every sweetmeat that had been laid in bowls and emptied 3 whole barrels of mead. The hall fell quieter with each course. Thrym shifted on his seat and spoke aside to the maid. He said he had never seen a woman consume so much food without dying of it. Loki bowed and smiled and explained in the mild voice of one who has made a life of explanations. The bride had not touched a bite for 8 nights, he said, so eager was she to come to Jotunheim. She had refused food the way a child refuses sleep on the night before a fair. Thrym nodded, delighted that he was so desired. The moment came for ceremony. Thrym leaned forward to kiss the bride and lifted the veil. He found himself looking into eyes that burned like embers fanned in a new wind. He slid back and spoke again to the maid, whose expression still invited confidence and not alarm. The maid said that the bride had not slept for 8 nights for longing, and that her eyes were hot with that longing and with travel. The giants laughed and relaxed and reached for their cups. Thrym called then for the hammer to be brought to seal the blessing of the marriage, according to giant custom. Servants came bearing Mjolnir as 4 men might carry a heavy stone that has some holiness. They laid it on the lap of the veiled bride so that the marriage could be hallowed. The bride's hands moved like hawks stooping. The veil came away. Thor stood up inside the wedding dress, and his roar filled the beams. He took the hammer by the short haft that had always known his grip, and he struck Thrym so that the giant's crown shattered like a pond in Thor. He turned and struck the giant's kin where they sat. The sister of Thrym had asked for gold from the bride as a morning gift, and Thor gave her what his hands provide. The hall emptied of life in a rush of broken cups and falling benches. Loki threw off the maid's clothes and kept moving, because there are moments when even wit must admit that the argument has passed to other instruments. Thor strode through the doorway with the hammer on his shoulder and the ruin behind him. The chariot waited. The goats snorted and pawed. The road that had been long in fear was short in triumph. The sky loosened and a first small rain fell as if to settle the dust. They crossed the boundary and the wall received them. Brisinga men went back to its owner. The keys were returned to their hooks. Mjolnir hung again on the belt where it belongs. No one in Asgard took up a harp and sang a ballad of Thor in a bridal veil. They laughed later in private over cups, and that laughter did not cheapen the event. It reminded them that courage is not always solemn. The story stood for something the gods do not forget. The hammer hallows as well as harms. It blesses a bed and a threshold, and a child in the arms of a mother. When Thrym asked for the hammer as a wedding pledge, he showed that even giants understand its sanctity, though they would twist it to their own gain. The old poem that keeps this tale likes a good joke, but it does not miss the doctrine behind the laughter. It shows that Loki's cunning belongs to order when it is called to the work of restoration. It shows that Thor's appetite and strength are the twin engines that keep the middle world safe. It shows that a hall loses its ease when its central tool is missing, and that the return of that tool restores more than safety. It restores the ability to bless. From that day, men who fastened little hammers under their shirts and women who asked for a hammer to be laid on the bridal lap knew that the story had passed into the customs that hold a people together. When the thunder walked again across the sky, the sound carried relief as well as warning. The goats stamped in their stall at night and did not limp. The watchman turned on his tower and breathed a little easier. The maker of songs found his words again, and the fire on the hearth looked like a guest and not a threat. Asgard slept a first easy sleep. And in the morning Thor stood in the yard and turned the hammer over in his hand as if to remind it, and himself, that they were one thing. Loki's place among the gods was always a contested seat. He had sworn brotherhood with Odin and drank the pledge that binds one life to another. Yet his blood runs from the house of giants. His father is called Farbauti, his mother Laufey or Nal, and in his company mischief walks as an equal to brilliance. Among the women of the far forest called Ironwood, he kept a bond with Angerboda, whose name speaks of sorrow brought near. From that union came 3 children who are not like other children. Their births read like notes written in the margin of fate. The first is a serpent that will not be measured by any fisher's cord. Jörmungandr came small enough to hold in 2 hands, coils cold with the memory of Niflheim. Odin looked once and looked again and saw not a garden snake but the outline of a world problem. He took the young thing and flung it into the ocean that girdles Midgard. There the serpent found home, and food, and a horizon that never ends. It grew long and older and clever, and in time its body stretched around the earth until its snout met its own tail. The sea rose and fell with that slow breathing. Men who fish the deep sometimes speak of a white eye far below their keels, and are careful afterward with oaths. In songs that sailors favour, there is a line about a hammer lifted in a boat and an ox head used for bait. That day lies ahead. For now it is enough to know that the world serpent has taken its station, and that the sea knows its weight. The second child is a wolf born with a king's shoulders. They named him Fenrir, and also Fenris Wolf and Frajvitnir in older lists. His paws were too large for youth, and his appetite had no ceiling. The Aesir did not at first slay him. They judged that a foe kept in sight is safer than a foe raised in secret, and they thought to tame him with kindness and close watch. Only Tyr found courage enough to feed him daily. He brought meat in both hands and learned the sound of Fenrir's breath. When patience wore thin, the wolf grew as if each rib were a season, and each season doubled. Old prophecies muttered by wise women said that the wolf would break bonds no smith could make, and that his wide mouth would one day close upon the highest god. Around that kennel the air felt strained like a bowstring. The gods did not speak of the day to come. They counted food and sharpened their minds. The third child is a girl whose body tells 2 truths. Hel is her name. One side of her is living and fair. The other is blue-black as a winter bruise and still as a churchyard. Odin sent her down and outward to the far reaches where cold springs rise. She was given a realm and a charge. The realm men call Hel or Helheim, and the charge is to house all who die not by sword or spear, but by age and sickness and sorrow. Her hall is El-Judnir, near where cold lamps burn. Old lore gives her dish the name hunger, and her knife the name famine. Her bed is called sick bed, and her bed curtains are called bleakly. Her servants, Ganglati and Ganglo, move slowly as if their joints were made of dusk. At the cave called Nipahelia, the hound Germa bays when a new soul comes by. And over the river Gjöll, a bridge arches that glows pale as hoarfrost. A maiden named Modguda keeps that crossing and asks the traveller for his name and errand. Beyond stands the gate called Helgrind, and beyond that the long fields without sun, where most of mankind abides. It is not a place only of punishment. It is a place of keeping. The sting there is not flame, but memory. The wise notice how the gods answered these births. The serpent they sent to the outermost water, the place that needs a belt if the middle lands are to hold. The wolf they kept inside their own fence under watchful eyes, a decision that cost them sleep and later blood. The girl they enthroned in a necessary office and made her keeper of what most must one day be. These are not random moves. They are an admission that the world contains forces that cannot be rubbed out, only placed where they can do their work without unmaking the rest. Hel's realm shaped the customs of Midgard. Men buried shoes with their dead so the long road would not fall hard on bare feet. They laid a coin, or a knife, or a token in the hand, not to bribe a ferryman of another people, but to carry worth into a country where worth is counted in remembrance. They spoke the name of the dead at the door and tied a knot in a cord to make grief wait its turn. When a body went to the ship and the flame, folk said the Bright Ones had called him. When a body went into the earth, they spoke of Hel as a house with a latch that opens for every family. Prophecy ran ahead of these children like shadow before a storm. In the seer's song that Odin bought with rings and attention, we hear of a woman in Ironwood who nurses wolf kindred and sends them out against the sky. The sun and the moon will feel teeth that have learned on bone. The Midgard serpent will lift its head and spill poison into air and water. The great wolf will break what no one thought could break. Hell will open her gate, and an army that never drew a sword in life will march under a pale banner. These are not yet events. They are warnings placed like cairns along a road that the gods already walk. Loki did not boast of these offspring in Asgard. He is a father who does not bring a cradle into the hall. Yet he did not renounce them either. When the gods spoke in private of the children of grief, they spoke also of the bargains they had already made with fate. Odin had traded an eye for sight and a part of himself for the runes. He knew the price of trying to forget what has been foreseen. He therefore set the serpent by the ocean, the girl in her seat, and the wolf under a watch that would soon require more than meat and iron. There is a grave tidiness in this arrangement. The sea has its master coil, the underworld has its queen who keeps the house with stern fairness. The courtyard of the gods has its danger that grows with every feeding. The middle lands continue to plough and to marry and to sing, but the singers begin to flavour their songs with a salt that is not from the shore. They understand that the days are numbered not by clocks only, but by promises and by debts. A game is in play whose board was cut from Ymir's bones, and on that board these three children are pieces that no hand can pass back to the box. The poets who love lists because lists keep fear in lines say also that Loki's household holds other lives. Sigyn sits by him and is faithful past ordinary endurance. From that marriage came sons whose names diverge in the sagas, and their fates will be bound to punishments not yet reached. Earlier still, Loki bore when he slipped into the form of a mare and lured away a certain builder's stallion. That tale belongs to craft. These children belong to foreboding. Together they show that the trickster breeds both helpers and ending signs. So the world settled into a tense balance. The gods kept feast days and judgments and rode out at dawn to the first road as they always had. In the night some woke and listened for a far surf that was not water. Tyr fed the wolf and did not speak of the tightness in his chest. Fishermen mended nets and watched the horizon, as if a ridge had risen a little where no land is. Women who had washed the dead spoke softer when they sat by the fire afterward. The ash stood and drank at its wells. The squirrel ran his errand of insults. The dragon chewed. The Norns wrote, "In such a world, the next wise act is to bind what can still be bound." Fenrir grew as if the seasons themselves were his bones. The meat that fed him was the size of oxen, and the bowls that held his water were troughs cut from single logs. His breath misted even in summer, and his eyes learned the habit of suspicion. A prophecy ran beside him the way a shadow runs beside a rider. It said that this wolf would one day unhouse the highest god. The Aesir chose to watch him rather than hunt him. They told themselves that a danger kept in sight is the safer danger. Only Tyr dared set a hand to the wolf's muzzle and bring food with the calm of a man who has already counted the cost. When Fenrir's paws pressed deeper prints with each passing moon, the gods proposed a game of strength. They had dwarves forge an iron fetter and named it Leoingra. It was thick as the wrist of a stonecutter and ribbed with cunning. They invited the wolf to test himself upon it. Fenrir opened his mouth in what might have been a smile. He set his legs and let them wind the chain round his body. At the signal, he surged. The lynx sang and burst like rotten ice. Iron pieces lay in the grass, and the wolf shook his mane as a dog shakes rain from its coat. The Aesir feigned wonder and praise as if they had not expected this first victory. They sent again for the smiths, and the dwarves returned with a second chain, heavier by far. They called it Dromi. It was studded and bound with runes that promised stubbornness. Again they suggested a trial, and again Fenrir agreed. He flexed and twisted, and found the chain held for a long breath. His eyes narrowed, then he braced his hind legs, bored his front claws into the earth, and threw himself outward with a violence that cracked stones underfoot. The fetter tore. The last link snapped and flew into a birch with a sound like a struck shield. The wolf laughed without words. The gods smiled thinly and spoke together in quiet voices. Odin sent secret messengers to Svartalfaheimr and bade the dwarf masters make a third, binding, not of iron, but of things that do not invite strength to answer strength. The dwarves asked for 6 ingredients that do not belong to ordinary reckoning. They took the sound of a cat's footstep, which is silence made nimble. They took the beard of a woman, which exists only in riddles. They took the roots of a mountain, which lie deeper than guesses. They took the sinews of a bear, which do their work out of sight. They took the breath of a fish, which leaves no trace in the water that carried it. They took the spittle of a bird, which dries before it falls. From these impossibilities they made a ribbon smooth as silk and strong beyond hope. They named it Gleipnir. They said that men would never again hear cats come, nor find women with beards, nor see mountains uprooted, and that bears would keep their strength, and fish swim, and birds sing, because the stuff of those wonders had gone into this one binding. The gods carried Gleipnir to a dark lake named Umsvörtnir, and to the island in its middle called Lyngvi. There they spoke to Fenrir as companions who wished to be entertained by a feat that would fill the benches with stories. The wolf sniffed the ribbon. It looked soft. It weighed less than a sash. He felt the chill that tells a hunter when a trap is near. He set his jaws and said that he would not be bound by such a toy unless one of the gods placed a hand in his mouth, as a pledge that no treachery was intended. If he could break the ribbon, he would release the hand. If the ribbon bit and held by magic, he would take his price. Silence fell. No one stepped forward. They looked to Odin, and he didn't speak. Thor scowled and stared at the lake. Freyr shifted his weight and studied the grass that found purchase in the thin soil. Then Tyr moved. He had fed Fenrir with his own fingers, and had looked into the yellow lamp of that gaze. He knew that good faith sometimes walks with blood. He held out his right hand. The wolf lowered his head and took it between his teeth without pressure. The other gods wrapped Gleipnir around the legs and shoulders and neck of the beast. They cast the loose ends about the rocks. Fenrir tried a modest pull and felt the ribbon tighten. He dug his claws deep and heaved. He snapped and writhed and swelled in rage until the island trembled, but Gleipnir only grew smoother and held more fast. He lay panting at last and understood that he'd been trapped by a thing that did not show strength on its face. His eyes went to Tyr. The god didn't draw away. He did not beg. He set his jaw. Fenrir clamped down. The hand came away at the wrist and fell into the heather like a small white stone. They anchored the fetter with a chain called Gelgja to the rock called Gjöll, and from there to a great boulder named Thviti, so that no quick mischief could unmake what the dwarves had made with long art. They thrust a sword into the wolf's open mouth to hold the jaws apart. The hilt rested on the gums and the point fixed in the palate, and foam poured from Fenrir's lips until it made a river that men afterward called Varn, which is to say, hope. He lay there glaring, and the grass around him ceased to grow. The lake drew back from the shore as if in distaste. Birds avoided that sky. Only Tyr looked on him without flinching, for Tyr had already paid and had kept the bargain for all. So the threat within the fence was put under a curb that could not be broken by bellowed rage. The gods returned to their halls with the gait of men who have done what had to be done and will not boast of it. They did not hold a feast. They sat quieter at evening. Tyr wore his sleeve pinned, and his smile did not falter. In judgments afterward he was given a greater hearing, because people who have suffered for the peace of others speak with a gravity that is not learned from books. Old law adds details as if to fix the binding with pegs of memory. It was the island called Lyngvi where the wolf was fettered, and the lake Amsvörtnir that looked on without favour. The dwarf ribbon was fair to the eye like summer cloth and deadly to effort. Its name means the open one that tightens. The chain that led away from it took its name from the resounding stone. The boulder that held the last length was named for firmness. The sword that kept the jaws apart turned drool to a stream whose name men mutter when they ask that courage hold one day more. This is how skulls keep a tale from drifting. They bind it to places and to names. The wolf learned and waited. He lay in the heather and watched the clouds move, and his eyes counted years with more patience than any shepherd. He knew that he had not lost only because the gods were cunning. He had lost because he himself had asked for a pledge, and one god had given it without flinching. Such lessons are bitter. Such lessons grow teeth. In the visions that the seer sold for a high price, there is a passage that says the bonds will one day fall away as if they had been rope cut with a single stroke. The wolf will stand and open his mouth so wide that the lower jaw drags the ground and the upper jaw touches the sky. Fate will go out to meet him, and a son will answer for a father with a boot made from every scrap of leather men ever trimmed from their shoes. For now, the island holds. For now, the ribbon does not fray. The watchman hears the sound the sword makes between the jaws, and knows it is not the sound of triumph, but of time purchased. The gods continue to judge beneath the ash. They still ride in the morning to the root where the Norns bless the bark. They still lay hands on shoulders and decide hard cases, yet every feast ends with the sense of a door shut on a winter night and a wind that prowls past looking for a latch left undone. The binding of Fenrir is not reassurance. It is a stay of sentence, and a promise to keep the centre in repair until the appointed day. Among the shining halls of Asgard, there is one whiter than new snow and cleaner than a priest's hands before prayer. It is brighter, a broad gleam, and there Balder held court. No unclean thing could cross its threshold. He was beloved not for power alone, but for the way his presence steadied men. Gentle and fearless, husband of Nanna, father of Forseti, who weighs disputes until both parties nod, Balder was the bright centre that kept anger from hardening into habit. When he began to dream of death, the benches fell silent. The dreams were clear and cold. He woke speaking names that made even Odin sit straighter. He told of a dark hall down under the roots, where a high seat stood prepared, and a bench was newly washed. He could smell the sharp chill of the place that takes most of mankind. Frigg gathered the gods and spoke without delay. She would remove danger by removing permission. She walked the worlds as only a mother can. She took oaths from fire and from water, from iron and from every metal that remembers the forge, from stone and from earth, from illness and from poison, from beasts that go on foot, and from birds that go on wing, from trees and vines and every creeping thing. Each swore to do Balder no harm. When she returned to Fensalir and told what she had done, a weight left the room. The success spread a kind of play. In the field before the hall, the gods made sport of their own safety. They set Balder at the centre and cast at him to prove the world had bound itself for love of him. Spears spun and turned aside in the air. Stones arced and fell harmless at his feet. Swords rang flat on the bright mail he wore and left not a scratch. Arrows refused their targets as if ashamed. The benches roared with relief. Even the servants came out to laugh. No one counted this as arrogance. It was thanksgiving in the form of a game, but vows are threads, and threads can be missed. In a wood not far from Fensalir grew a young mistletoe, pale and small, and without the threat that grows obvious in oaks and yews. Frigg had walked past it with a smile, saying that such a child of a plant needed no oath. Loki heard the whole story as a guest in her house, and turned the kindness to his use. He had the gift that makes mischief seem like a clever solution until the moment after. He took the shape of an old woman with a shawl drawn close and sat near Frigg's seat, as women do when the house is busy. He asked in a mild voice whether every creature and thing had sworn. Frigg answered that all had promised except a little mistletoe that was too young to frighten anyone. Loki thanked her for the story with a nod as small as a pin, and went out with his head bowed as if in sympathy. He found the plant on a north-facing trunk and cut it with a careful hand. In his fingers it hardened from twig to dart. He polished the point on his sleeve and looked for a place to spend it. That day the assembly was at its game again, and all of them joined in except Hodder, Baldur's blind brother, who stood apart with his staff and a lonely look. Loki drew near and asked softly why he did not honour Baldur with the rest. Hodder answered that he could not see to throw, and that he had no weapon even if he could. Loki placed the mistletoe in his hand and guided his arm. He offered to aim for him so that Hodder could be part of the joy and not its spectator. The kindness was perfect. Hodder cast. The little thing flew straight. It struck Baldur in the breast and went into him as if it had been hunger. He fell as a tree falls when the axe has bitten deeper than the woodcutter guessed. The field stopped breathing. There was no sound at all while the gods ran forward. They touched him and called his name. He didn't answer. Frigg dropped to her knees and gathered his head into her lap. Odin stood with his jaw set and his eye as empty as a winter sky. Thor gripped the hammer until the short haft creaked. Someone lifted Hodder's hand and saw what he held and understood. Loki had already stepped back into the crowd. All that had been given by oath was suddenly revealed as loan rather than law. The sun seemed to hesitate in its course. Men later said the day was shorter, and the next night had too much of it. The hall lights guttered and were lit again, and still there was not enough brightness. Nanna stood beside her husband, and her face changed with the change that has only one cause. Forseti, who had always spoken softly and made peace with a word, said nothing at all. In the midst of grief, a will rose. The gods would not let this end be the last word. There were ways to bargain with Hel, whose office is keeping, not cruelty. To bargain, one must go. And to go, one must know the road. Before any embassy could be sent, the rites of honour has to be set in motion. Odin bent and whispered something into the ear of his dead son. Words no one else heard and no poet claims to know. Then the company of the High Ones turned to the work that custom requires, when a light has been put out. The old songs say the earth itself shivered then, and that dreams of a threefold winter ran like frost across the minds of seers. Whether that is true, or merely neat craft by later skalds, the truth is heavy enough without ornament. A life that steadied others was gone through a fault so small that a mother had walked past it without worry, and through a malice so clever that it borrowed the hands of a blind man to do its work. The bright age tilted. They bore Baldur to his ship, Ringhorn, the largest that ever tasted salt. It rested, hauled high upon rollers, and would not stir for any hand. Messengers rode for Hyrrokin, a giantess who kept her dwelling in the deep forest beyond all farms. She came riding a wolf, with vipers for reins. She leapt from the saddle, took hold of the prow and pushed once. The ship shot forward so fiercely that the rollers sparked and the earth trembled. Thor lifted his hammer to strike her for that affront, but the gods set their hands on his arm and spoke him back from rage. They laid Baldur upon the deck with solemn order. Nanna, his wife, saw the body, and grief went through her like winter through an orchard. She fell, and her spirit went out of her. They set her beside her husband upon the ship. Odin came and laid on the pyre Draupnir, the ring that drops 8 bright copies on the 9th night, as a gift to his son beyond the breath of wind. Frigg sent tokens for Hel's queen to soften the welcome. Freya led forth the stallion that had carried Balder in peacetime, and they placed it on the ship with saddle and harness. Thor hallowed the pyre with the hammer so that the passage would be lawful. A dwarf named Lita ran before his feet. In the heat of sorrow, Thor kicked him into the blaze, and the dwarf perished. Torches found the pitch. Ringhorn went out onto the water burning, and a black line of smoke drew itself across the day. That was the farewell of Asgard to its brightest. There remained the matter of ransom. Hermodr, the swiftest of Odin's sons, asked for Sleipnir. He mounted the grey horse who runs as easily over sea as over field, and set out. 9 nights he rode through vales where nothing grows, and across slopes where light seems a rumour. On the 10th, he came to the river Gjöll, roofed by a sky that does not warm. A bridge arched there that glowed pale. A maiden named Modguda kept the crossing and asked who passed so loud. Hermodr named himself and said that he sought Balder. She told him that the dead had crossed the day before and that he would find Hel's Hall down the road into the north. He rode hard until he reached Helgrind, the gate that most must pass. He touched Sleipnir's flanks, and the horse leaped so cleanly that the iron did not ring. In the hall he found Balder seated in the high place that had been prepared in dreams. The dead man was unharmed, and the honour about him was plain. Hermodr stayed the night. In the morning, he asked Hel to send Balder home to those who loved him. Hel's law is keeping and balance. She said that she would release him if all things shed tears for Balder. If even a single creature refused, he would remain. Hermodr rose and prepared to ride. Balder gave him messages for his kin, and sent also Nanna's gifts for Frigg and for Fulla. Hel placed into Hermodr's keeping Draupnir, which had been laid upon the pyre, and told him to return it to Odin. Sleipnir took the gate in a single bound once more, and Hermodr made for Asgard with news, and with tokens that proved he had stood in the shadowed hall. Chapter 20. One Refusal. Thirk and the Locked Gate. The gods sent messengers across the worlds. They spoke to men and to giants, to elves of light and of dark, to mountains and to ore veins, to rivers, to trees and to grasses, to sickness and to the biting things that creep. One by one they wept for Balder. The stones sweated. The trees let fall leaves before their time. The beasts lowered their heads. The waves darkened. All wept until the company returned by the long road, believing the condition met. On the last day they came to a cave where sat a giantess named Thork. They begged for her tear. She answered that she would weep dry tears at Balder's bier. The living and the dead pleased her alike. Let Hel hold what she has. So she spoke, and nothing could move her. Those who read riddles with ill will said that Thok was Loki in another skin. Whether that is truth or spite, the refusal served his malice. Because one voice withheld sorrow, Hel's decree stood. Balder would remain. The loss was confirmed by the law that had been offered as a hope. In the halls the benches began to feel the cold from far places. The gods sent messengers across the worlds. They spoke to men and to giants, to elves of light and of dark, to mountains and to ore veins, to rivers, to trees and to grasses, to sickness and to the biting things that creep. One by one they wept for Balder. The stones sweated. The trees let fall leaves before their time. The beasts lowered their heads. The waves darkened. All wept until the company returned by the long road, believing the condition met. On the last day, they came to a cave where sat a giantess named Thok. They begged for her tear. She answered that she would weep dry tears at Balder's bier. The living and the dead pleased her alike. Let Hel hold what she has. So she spoke, and nothing could move her. Those who read riddles with ill will said that Thok was Loki in another skin. Whether that is truth or spite, the refusal served his malice. Because one voice withheld sorrow, Hel's decree stood. Balder would remain. The loss was confirmed by the law that had been offered as a hope. In the halls, the benches began to feel the cold from far places. The hunt for the mischief maker had the clarity of duty. Loki fled Asgard as men flee a fever. He made himself a house on a lonely mountain with 4 doors so that he could look out in every direction. By day, he hid as a salmon in a pool that lay near the foot of the cliff. In the evening, he sat by the fire and wove a net of fine cord to amuse his impatience. He saw the gods crossing the slope and threw the net into the flame so that it would not betray him. They entered the house and found the ash outlines of a tool they did not know. Kvasir studied the shape and understood what hand had made it. They plaited a net from the ash that was not yet cold and went down to the river. They cast above the pool and walked in a line, drawing the mesh through the water. The fish was clever and dived under the net and lay in the gravel. They weighted the lead line and cast again. The fish sprang for the sea. Thor waded out and stood below the cataract with his hands. The salmon passed and Thor gripped the tail. The fish writhed and almost slipped the hold, but the grip was too sure. That is why salmon are narrow at the tail. They brought Loki out of the river and stripped him of disguise. They bound him and took him to a cave steep with shadows. There they set the punishment that the story remembers whenever the ground moves underfoot. They took his sons. One was named Narfi and one was named Vali. They turned Vali into a wolf. He tore his brother in a frenzy, and the gods took the entrails of Narfi and used them for cords. They bound Loki to 3 stones, one under his shoulders, one under his loins, one under his knees, and when the cords hardened, they became like iron. Skadi came and took a venomous snake and fixed it above his face so that the drops would fall on his brow. Sigyn, his wife, came and sat and held a bowl to catch the poison. When the bowl fills, she must rise to pour it away, and in those moments the drops strike. The pain is so sharp that Loki twists and the whole earth shudders. This is the beginning of earthquakes in the lore of the North. So Loki remained, Balder remained, Nanna remained. Doom was returned to the hand that had given it. Hell kept the gates shut by the word that all must weep. Asgard kept a chair empty and a grief that did not fade. The gods had taken a traitor and had made the punishment fit the measure of his injury. The world learned a new sound, the small clink of venom into a bowl, and the sudden groan of the ground when mercy cannot keep pace with pain. Prophecy grew louder in the minds of those who listen. A river of delay had been purchased, but the sea that waited beyond it still existed. After Balder's pyre and after the binding of Loki, the world began to lean toward its ending. The omens did not shout at first, they gathered. The ash groaned more often, and the Norns poured their white water with a gravity that made even gods fall silent as they entered the council field. In Midgard, old women woke from dreams of wolves running along the ridge of the sky, and men who had never feared the sea began to muffle their oars. These were the first thin ripples from a far storm. Then came the long winter. The gods had promised it for a high price. Fimbulwinter did not follow the calendar. It arrived with snow from every quarter and wind that shaved the skin. It lasted through 1 whole year, and then another and then a third without a summer to loosen it. Frost laid iron on doors. Crops failed in the dark soil. The kindling box stood empty because no one dared cut the last grove. The worst losses came not from cold, but from hearts that forgot kinship. Brothers took up axes against brothers. Fathers and sons counted old slights and called them debts. Guests were met at the threshold with a hand on a knife. It was as if the warmth had been bled from courtesy as well as from cattle. The heavens gave their own witness. For ages 2 wolves had paced the sky and kept the sun and the moon honest. The hunters were named Skirl and Hati. During Fimbulwinter they closed the distance. The sun dimmed and went out in a sudden bite. The moon followed. Stars shook free from their places and vanished like sparks carried off by the wind. Day and night lost their meaning. In that deeper dusk, 3 roosters crowed to wake the armies of both sides. In Asgard, the golden Gullinkambi shouted on the roof of Valhalla. In Jotunheim, a bird called Fjalar answered from a red wood. Down in the shadows of hell, a soot-coloured rooster cried to the hosts that, "Remember the taste of air." The earth answered with quake after quake. Mountains split along faults older than the gods. Caverns opened like mouths. Beneath the roots of the world, the old eater worked faster. Ymir boiled with snakes. The bonds of many things failed. The hound Garma tore loose from the cave called Gnipahella, and his howling made hall timbers groan. On the island in the Black Lake, the ribbon that had held the wolf exploded without a sound. Fenrir rose and stretched. His jaws gaped so wide that the lower struck the ground and the upper scraped the sky. In the girdling sea, the Midgard serpent began to move. Its coils chafed, its body heaved, and the ocean climbed its length in great hills of water. Venom smoked on its tongue, and the breath that rose from its throat turned to a cloud that poisoned the air. Muspelheim at last stepped forward into the story it had been saving. From the south, the rider led a company of fire giants, whose armour shone like a forge floor. In his hand, a sword, burned brighter than the surface of the sun. He set his feet upon the rainbow bridge and marched. Bifrost cracked and fell away in pieces. From the north, black sails gathered on a ship that no living carpenter had built. It was Naglfar, the nail ship made in hell from the pairings of the dead. From that shore, Hrym came at the helm, though other poets sing that Loki took the steering oar and piloted the vessel through fields of ice. The point is not the argument, but the army. Every plank creaked with the weight of those whom Hel had kept along other roads. Those same dead marched overland behind Loki with faces white and unsmiling. The giants from Stone Country left their citadels. The frost that had been their ally now served as bridge and banner. Trollkind, Wolfkind, and hosts from the Rim came to a place long named for this meeting. Yggdrasil shook to its crown. The eagle that watches from the highest bough screamed. The 4 stags stamped and tore at bark. Down among the roots, Nidhogger tore as if he could drag the tree into the dark by hunger alone. Dwarfs stood in their doorways and moaned in the language of stone. In Valhalla, benches rattled, and spears in their racks beat together like hail on a roof. The Einarjar, who had practiced each day and died each evening to be whole again, rose with their shields. Valkyries tightened the buckles on their horses. In the watchtower by the end of the broken bridge, Heimdall lifted the horn no one wants to hear and put it to his mouth. The note that went out was as old as the ash and as clear as first water on rock. It travelled all the roads that bind the realms, every being understood. Odin made one last visit to council. He rode swiftly to Mimir's well and bent his head over the water where his eye looks back at him from the deep. He did not ask for victory. He asked to be utterly awake. Then he went home and buckled on his armour, black as a raven's back, and took up the spear Gungnir. He called to his sons and to his fostered heroes and to the friends of his house, and together they marched out of the Golden Gate. The field waited where all songs had placed it. The name is Vigrid, and in old measures it is said to be 100 leagues across. There was room for everything. From one side the gods and the chosen dead and the Valkyries came in order. From the other side the fire from the south, the frost from the north. The ocean carried anger from the Rim, the serpent lifting rings the size of hills, and the wolf treading a path that killed grass with every step. The air was so saturated with omen that even the bravest kept their voices low. Some stories tell that before the ranks collided, a final sign caught the eye of the living. In the new world of shadow, a hall appeared that few had seen. Light spilled from the doors of a place called Gimle, a promise made long ago. It didn't hold the battle. It was a lantern held up to a road already chosen. On the other horizon, a hall roofed in serpents showed its teeth, and poison rained from the rafters. This too was a sign of what comes of oaths broken without shame. Between promise and refusal, the hosts advanced. The last arrangements were made in moments that felt like days. Tyr tested the strap on the stump of his right arm and smiled in a way that steady men understand. Freyr stood without his good sword and took up a horned weapon fit for a huntsman. Thor weighed the hammer and drew in a breath like a man who has set his feet on rock. Heimdall rested his hand on the horn that had done its work and waited for a face he knew. Vidar stood apart, silent, and looked at his boot where leather cuttings had been sewn through ages into a shoe that is more fate than garment. Honir cast lots and read what he already suspected. Frigg looked toward a shadow that was once a child and said nothing that anyone could hear. It is right that the saga pauses here. The reckoning is upon them. The pieces stand as the poets placed them after long memory and careful talk. The winter has done its work. The hunters have eaten the lights of the sky. The dead have left their quiet, and the living have left their halls. The tree shakes from root to crown, and the horn's note still lingers on the edges of hearing. Now all that remains is the clash that ends an age and begins the tale that follows it. Ranks met on the plain that old verses measure at 100 leagues. A cold light lay on mail and on antlers fixed to helmets. From one side came the Aesir and the Inhajar, the chosen dead who had trained each noon for this hour. From the other came frost and fire, stone and serpent, wolf and the restless hosts from hell. The ash shivered above them, and the ground answered with a dull sound like a drum buried under turf. Odin rode first, with ravens wheeling and wolves at his stirrups. Gungnir levelled in his hand, and the point marked a straight line to the widest mouth in any song. Fenrir loomed, mane bristling with sparks from the broken bridge, and eyes like winter stars. The spear flew, the wolf came through it, and the shaft shattered. Odin struck again, and the great jaws closed. The All-Father went down without a cry. For a moment the field seemed to pause, as if a wind had missed a beat. Vidar moved then, the silent son whose patience had never been counted until this day. He stepped into the shadow of the wolf and set his thick shoe upon the lower jaw, a boot sewn through ages from every scrap of leather men had trimmed from their footwear. He took hold of the upper jaw with his hand and tore until bone creaked and the throat opened. In other tellings he drives a sword into the heart while the boot pins the jaw. Each version keeps the same truth. Vidar avenged his father and stood with blood about his knees and did not speak. Thor, meanwhile, faced the Midgard serpent. Jormungandr lifted coils the size of hills and vomited black venom that hissed when it touched shield or stone. Thunder walked with the hammer. The sky shook. The snake's head reared and came down. A Mjolnir smashed it so that light flashed in the brains of men who were not looking toward the fight. The serpent died, and the sea fell back from the rims it had reached. Thor took 9 steps on a ground that turned strange underfoot, and his face whitened with the poison that had entered him. He fell with his hand still on the short haft, and the hammer lay quiet beside him, as if it too understood the cost. Tyr met the hound that had broken from Nipperhelir. Garma's coat was spiked with frost, and its breath burned like fever. They closed and tore. The god who had once given his right hand for a promise now gave the rest for the keeping of the field. Garma fell, and Tyr fell. The place where they died was left bare of grass by agreement between the two, for courage honours courage, even when the mouths that held it are full of blood. Freyr stood before Surtur with a hunter's horn and a weapon that shone, but was not his best. Once he had sent his sword away as a bride price and had not called it back. He thrust and parried, and the blaze from the fire giant's blade threw red over his face. Surtur pressed, and Freyr went down, and the flame showed no pity. This is the lesson he leaves behind. Gifts given in season return as honour, gifts given without thought return as hunger. Heimdall and Loki found each other at last on broken ground near the heap of fallen shields. The watchman had blown his horn, and the sound still rang in the bones of men. The trickster had slipped his bonds when the earth shook, and had led the dead with a calm face that did not belong to a friend. They closed, and the clash looked small beside wolf and serpent and the sword of the south, yet the tale insists on it. They wounded each other deeply, and each fell. Silence closed over their quarrel, and the field moved on. Njörda had gone back to Vanaheim at the first sign that the age was turning. Freya took her share of the slain to Folvanga, and did not count faces only, but deeds, and the grace with which duty had been borne. Herda cast lots and foresaw enough to keep his footing where many slipped. Frigg watched, and if any word left her mouth, the wind took it at once. Over all this, Surtur swung his blade. Fire leapt like a pack slipping. Leashes. The plain became a long ember. The sky split and fell away like old bark from a tree. Mountains cracked. Rivers boiled. The pillars of the world gave way, and the seas ran over the edges of the story. Bifrost had already failed, and now the gods' men had walked since the first winter came apart. Dwarfs groaned in stone doorways, and the stone began to flow. In the ash, the eagles screamed, and the dragon at the root bit, and sap ran like grief. The crown burned, and the trunk smoked, and the leaves curled. The three women at the well didn't lift their bowl again, for there was no bark left to mend. To the north, Naglfar cut a line across the last waters and ran aground on a shore that had forgotten its name. Hrym stood at the prow and saw a fire that was no sunrise. In the south, the sword of Surtur swelled until it filled the firmament as far as a man can see with eyes closed. The last cries ended and heat took the rest, and the wind rose once. And then there was no wind. Old stanzas at a bitter close. Nidegr came flying from the dark with dead men in his claws and a stain upon his teeth, and found nothing living to fear him. The world sank. The waves folded it and smoothed it, and the stars that had fallen lay cold in a night that had no room for maps. That is how the poets end the age. They do not blink or soften. They say simply that all that could burn burned, and all that could drown drowned, and the great game in the old house was finished. Yet within the smoke and the sea there remained a promise that had not been spent. A hall of light had shown itself to men who still breathed, and a word had gone out that not every seed dies under ash. The final work of Surtur was also a clearing. The last sound was not a scream, but a long hiss as water met iron. In that quiet something like a breath gathered, so the elder singers say, and the dark remembered dawn. Smoke thinned, ash settled on a sea as calm as a held breath. From that quiet a green lifted its head. Grass crept first, a pale film on slopes that had been cinders. Then birch and rowan pricked the ground with hopeful stems. Rivers ran again, clear this time, and their sound did not carry fear. Over a westward ridge an eagle rode the spray of a fall and searched the pools, as it had done in the days before men remembered counting. The world had ended with fire and flood, and yet the same old world, washed and sharpened, began to speak. The sun rose again, not the old sun that had been hunted down by a wolf, but her daughter, equally bright, who took her mother's path. Poets say that Saul had hidden the child before the chase was won, and that when the sky reopened, the young one stepped forward with a calm step, and the chariot remembered how to move. Day returned without apology. Night returned with a kinder face. Time found its measure as if it had been a lost livestock bell and now rang again from a familiar neck. On a hill whose name had survived, the burning Idavol survivors gathered. They were not many, but they were enough. Vidar came from the place where the wolf had died, and his boot was heavy with a deed that will never be retold without a held breath. Vali stood with him, the son who had been born for vengeance and had fulfilled it cleanly. Modi and Magni arrived leading Thor's goats, and carrying the hammer that had outlived venom and thunder. They had found Mjolnir on the quiet field where its owner fell, and now the tool held the weight of 2 futures rather than 1. Honir came slow and grave, a staff in his hand, and those who watched him said that he still heard hints from far water. From the ways of shadow came Balder and Hoda together, reconciled at last, released when the old law loosened with the breaking of almost everything else. The sight of those brothers standing shoulder to shoulder steadied the air. They looked upon the field where once they had set the benches of their councils, and they smiled as men smile when they step back into a house after a hard winter's absence. In the grass they found bright pieces, the golden game tokens of the first days. No one had buried them. Time had misplaced them. Now the earth gave them back as if to say that play is part of rule, and that the old delight in craft and contest must begin again with clean hands. The survivors laughed, and it was the first sound since the battle that did not carry a remnant of smoke. The land itself promised better behaviour. Fields bore without plough, ears of grain filled without a scythe worrying their necks. Fish moved in rivers as if the past had been a fever dream. Wind came in from sea with the smell of salt and not of ash. The harsher corners of the old world were not erased, but they seemed less eager to prove a point. A man could walk from wood to meadow and not look over his shoulder at every third step. Out beyond men and gods, a small story had kept itself safe. In a thicket called Hodmimis Holt, a pair of humans had hidden while the sword of Surtur scorched and the sea rose. They were Lif and Lifthrasir. Their names speak of life and the one who clings to life. Morning dew fed them when there was nothing else to eat. When the breathing of the earth calmed, they stepped out under the new sun and were not afraid. From their hunger and their gladness, a people began again. They did not find empty lessons. They found berries and a stream and a place to make a fire that would be watched more carefully than the fires of former days. The halls of the afterworld arranged themselves anew on high. A hall called Gimli shone with a light that is not borrowed. It waits for the righteous, a roof where truth is ease rather than labour. On a wide plain, a hall called Brimir offered ale that did not sour and company that did not grow thin. In the dark of hills, a place called Sindri gleamed for those who love craft and steady work. But not every old house was improved by mercy. Nastron remained, its walls flayed from the backs of oath-breakers. Through those ribs, poison still dripped. There the names of the treacherous were spoken, and the speaking was a sentence. It was a warning preserved among comforts. The world tree had suffered beyond telling, yet from the char along its trunk there came thin leaves, and from its crown a new whisper ran down the centuries that were just being born. The wells did not forget themselves. Urd remained memory. Verdandi remained the present that flowers and fades in the same breath. Schooled remained the dew that comes on quiet feet. They tended the bark with their shining clay, and with water drawn from a depth that had not dried even when the stars fell. Men who claim that fate was erased do not listen well. Fate was repaired, and its edges smoothed where they had cut like glass. A question rises whenever a tale gives you dawn after ruin. What of the old enmities? The poems glance toward the horizon and do not pretend more certainty than they own. They say that Nidhogg still flies once with a body in his claws and blood on his teeth. Then the verses stop, either because the singer wished to end with a shiver, or because warning must live alongside hope, if hope is to stay honest. Better to say that the new age will have its labours, and that the labours will be worth the song. Odin did not walk in that morning. His memory did. Men set a spear on a wall and said, "This is for the man who paid for truth." They did not worship absence, they kept counsel, which amounts to the same honour. Thor's steps did not shake the new fields, but the hammer on the belt of his sons set a pattern of protection that needed no explanation. Freya's smile was not seen at the first ploughing, yet the rain came on time, and the barns learned their old tricks. Baldur's seat in Breidablik glowed, and in his presence people spoke a shade more kindly, and let silence have its proper turn. Hoda's hand rested on the rail, and none doubted that justice could be blind and still exact. Tyr was missing from the circle, but when the first law stone was raised, his name was cut deep on it, because courage in the service of fair measure cannot be buried under ash. Among men, a few customs from the time before remained. A bride asked for the hammer to bless her bed. A craftsman scored a strip of wood with those small strokes that turn chance aside. A sailor poured a mouthful of ale into the river and asked it to be a road rather than a ditch. Genes carried memories the way soil carries seeds. A skald told the children the old tales and did not tidy the endings. He added a last lesson. When the world ends, keep your eyes open. When the world returns, keep your word. By slow degrees, the place of councils filled with speech that did not need to shout. A new company learned to sit on Idavol and to send riders from the first road with judgments that could stand a winter. They counted that a good day is one when the game pieces of gold are put away because work has gone well, and a better day is one when the pieces come out and everyone has time for play. They did not search for perfection in the shape of men. They kept balance instead, which was what the old gods had aimed at when they poured water on bark at morning. So the world remade itself along the lines of an older plan, but with a kinder light. Corn ripened without debt. Carvers stood without fear. A smith smiled at a small straight seam that would outlast his hand. A widow stood by a river and spoke the name of her husband and did not feel the cold of hell at her back. A child asked why the summer smells of honey, and someone answered that once upon a time a tree survived and 3 women would not let it die. A world can die and rise again, but stories do not survive by chance. They travel in mouths and on wood and stone, and they accept the changes that time demands so that the core may endure. After the ash cooled and green returned, memory became the last craft the North would practice with full devotion. What follows is not a list of texts only. It is a map of how a people kept the gods within reach, and how the gods, in turn, shaped the habits of that people. Before any vellum there were voices. Skalds stood in smoky halls with ice at the eaves and turned deeds into song. They taught listeners to hear a ship as the horse of the sea, to hear gold as a serpent's bed, to hear blood as the mead of the sword. Such kennings are not riddles for sport alone. They are a discipline that binds many layers of tale into single lines. Bragi Boddason is named as an early master. Egil Skallagrimsson carved runes to heal and to curse, and then sang over his work so that both sound and stroke would hold. In this way, story and spell walked together without shame. Runes themselves kept part of the house. The elder Futhark and later the younger Futhark were cut along lintels, and grave markers and on amulets worn close to the skin. A short plea appears often. Thor sanctify. On one stone a little hammer is carved where Christians would place a cross. On another a charm twists like a small river along the edge of a memorial and promises help to the one who reads it aloud without stumbling. These objects are not long myths written out. They are doorways. Through them the larger tales breathe. Some scenes were pressed into gold that thin hands could hold. Little foils called Guldgubba show paired figures meeting in a ritual embrace. Scholars see in them the memory of Heros Gamos rites, a blessing enacted in miniature that keeps field and house in good measure. Iron plates from island smithies show a one-eyed figure, a bent-backed trickster, and a strong man with a square-headed tool. A whetstone from Snetum carries a face whose lips are sewn. Fireside ash has kept that image when many polished halls have fallen. Stone carried more pictures. The picture stones of Gotland show a man fishing from a boat with an ox head for bait and a coil rising from the dark. The Gosforth Cross in the north of England shows a struggle with a serpent and a wolf and a rider on a strange horse. Christian carvers set their faith upon that shaft, and yet the old fights are there, weathered but legible, a reminder that stories overlap when people share winters. Temples stood while the old cult held sway. Adam of Bremen tells of a great house at Uppsala with walls that shone and a grove thick with fear. Sacrifices were made there on a cycle that kept kinship with the seasons. In Iceland, the law speaker once lay under a cloak and decided that one land should have one law so that families would not war forever. After that day, men could still make private offerings in barns and at sea rocks, but the public rites were ended. The word that ended them did not end the stories. When cold and fire had spent their rage upon the plains of myth, it fell, to scribes to carry memory on. In Iceland, a long-lived island without kings, men wrote in a language that matched their speech. A thin book that we call the Codex Regius gathered the poems of seers and insult feasts, wars with giants, and the sayings of kings who were not yet born. In those leaves you hear the Völva tell of the long winter and the high fire. You hear Odin boast of the spells he learned on the tree. You hear a dwarf list the names of night and day until dawn shows in the door. The book itself carries a quiet wonder. It arrived late into our hands after years hidden, and the gap in its leaves is like a missing plank in a familiar bridge. We cross anyway, because the river must be crossed. Another book set out to teach poets their craft and to save old names from confusion. Snorri Sturluson wrote of High One, Just as High, and Third in the guise of a friendly manual. He explained why the sea can be called Aegir's Mead, why a corpse can be called the hawk's share, why a king can be called a tree of rings. He told how Thor once lifted a cat that was more than a cat, and how he once drank from a horn that was more than a horn. He told why certain giantesses rode a wolf with snakes for reins and shoved a ship into the sea with one push. He begins with a tale that calls the gods men from Asia who dazzle the north with tricks and clever talk. That prologue pleases bishops, but the rest of the book refuses to forget what the people knew. It preserves the quarrels and the courtesies that make a pantheon more than a pageant. Not all memory lives in ink. Days of the week still speak old names in lands far from the fjords. Tuesday for Tyr and his single-handed fairness. Wednesday for Odin and his hunger for costly counsel. Thursday for Thor, whose hammer steadied barns and borders. Friday for a goddess of love and foresight whose name is spelled more than one way in the south and the north. Place names keep witness where men have farmed for 1,000 years. Fields and groves are still called the sacred space of Freya, the sanctuary of Thor, the meadow of Odin. A stone on Fruzan names a man who raised a bridge, and then says plainly that he baptized the people of the island. On that little text the two ages shake hands, laws tug at memory and shape it. The old codes from the Vestfjords urge fairness at the thing, yet do not hide that feast to the gods once stood beside the court. Later codes forbid the blood of sacrifice as a public rite, and fine those who keep the old seasons. Yet even as law changed, poets wrote not to defy, but to explain. They kept what was worth keeping. They set the stories in a past that felt safely far, and yet near, enough to blush the cheek, or to stiffen the back when justice is named. Heroic families carried the divine tales forward by analogy. A dragon horde teaches that greed sleeps with its eyes open. A doomed ring teaches that gifts must be given with measure. A Valkyrie teaches that choice has a face and a voice, not a blind roll of dice. The Völsung poems do not always bring the gods on stage, and yet the stage belongs to them. The shape of fate in those lines is the same shape as Circe sings when she looks from under her hood across the ages. Folklore kept other doors ajar. In winter, people speak of the wild hunt that tears across the night with dogs and riders. A tall one with a wide hat leads them. Children are told to come in when the wind turns that certain way. At midwinter, now called Christmas by most, old names still stir under the new. Yule fires burn, and a bearded gift-bearer walks over snow. Wise men do not insist on straight lines where lives are curved by cold and hope. Traditions fold. Archaeology finds the crumbs that hands drop without meaning to. A child's wooden toy hammered into mud at a ferry landing. A whalebone plaque scratched with a tiny man and a coil. A brooch with a ring that might be a sun, or might be a symbol known only to the woman who wore it. These are not proofs that this or that story is fact. They are proof that people carried meanings in their pockets and pinned them to their clothes, because meanings are warmth. At the end of the greatest poem, the seeress tells of halls that wait for the worthy, and then speaks, almost in a single breath, of a dragon that flies with bodies in his claws. She leaves us there between promise and warning. That balance is the heart of this religion of stories. The gods are brave and fallible. They make oaths and sometimes pay more than they planned. They die and return. And the world mends, and then must be mended again. The telling asks two things only. Remember and act as if your memory mattered. So the North remembers, on the tongue, in kennings that turn a ship into a stallion and a wave into a wall, on stone, in runes that bite a god to protect a traveller, in books copied by men who served a new altar yet loved old skill, in place names and weekdays and proverbs, in the hush that takes a room when winter speaks of itself with wind. The story began with a gap and a drip, and a cow and a giant and three brothers who made a world from the body of a threat. It ends, for now, with children stepping out of a thicket into a light that belongs to them, with friends returning from hell and smiling like men who have forgiven the night, and with a hammer placed once more in a careful hand.